I was sitting on the 12th floor of Federal Plaza in Manhattan when the phone rang. It was early morning, the light filtering through the window still grayish, as if the city couldn't quite wake itself up. The caller was a coordinator from the regional office in Queens. His tone was clipped, professional, but there was something underneath it. Hesitation, maybe, or disbelief. "Agent Carrick," he said, "we have a situation that requires your attention." I'd been with the Bureau for 11 years, long enough to know that when a coordinator calls you directly instead of sending an email, it's never routine. I grabbed my jacket from the back of my chair and asked him what we were dealing with. "A witness," he said, "from the Castellano case." The name hit me like cold water. The Castellano case had been closed for 7 years. Vincent Castellano, a mid-level money launderer for the Genovese family, had been found dead in his Astoria apartment in 2018. A single gunshot to the back of the head, execution style. We'd had one witness, a man named Adrian Kelch, who'd been coming out of the building's service entrance when he saw 2 men leaving Castellano's unit. Kelch had given us descriptions, worked with a sketch artist, even agreed to testify. Then 3 months before trial, Adrian Kelch drove his car into the East River off the Queensboro Bridge. His body was never recovered, but the dive team found the vehicle. The doors were locked from the inside. No signs of foul play. The case collapsed without him, and Castellano's killers walked. "What about the witness?" I asked. There was a pause on the line. "He walked into the 114th precinct an hour ago. Says his name is Adrian Kelch. Says he wants to finish his testimony." I was in Queens 40 minutes later. The precinct house on Astoria Boulevard was one of those old brick buildings that smelled like decades of coffee and paperwork. A sergeant met me at the desk and led me back through a warren of cubicles to an interview room. He didn't say much, but I could see it in his face. Whatever was behind that door had rattled him. The room was small, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Sitting at the metal table was a man I recognized from photographs. Thin face, receding hairline, wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a gray windbreaker and dark jeans, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He looked up when I entered, and I saw his eyes were clear. Calm. "Mr. Kelch," I said, taking the seat across from him. "I'm Agent Miles Carrick with the FBI. "I remember you," he said quietly. His voice was exactly as I remembered it from our interviews in 2018. Soft, measured. "You were the one who took my statement." I opened my notebook, keeping my expression neutral. "Mr. Kelch, I need to ask you some questions. Where have you been for the last 7 years?" He looked down at his hands. "I don't know how to explain it. Try. I've been here," he said. "In the city. I know you think I'm dead. I know about the bridge, the car. But I've been here the whole time." I studied his face. He didn't look 7 years older. If anything, he looked younger than he had in 2018. His skin was smooth, unlined. No gray in what remained of his hair. The photographs we'd used during the original investigation showed a man pushing 40, worn down by shift work and stress. The man sitting across from me could have been in his early 30s. "Mr. Kelch, we recovered your vehicle from the East River. Your wallet, your identification, everything was inside. We have evidence that places you at the scene of your own death." "I know," he said. And there was something in his voice, not quite sadness, something else. I can't explain that, but I'm here now, and I want to finish what I started. Those men I saw, the ones who killed Mr. Castellano, I can identify them. I can testify. I made him go through the whole story again. The night he'd seen the 2 men leaving Castellano's apartment, the descriptions he'd given, the threats he'd received afterward, the fear that had made him agree to protective custody. He remembered every detail, recited them with the same precision he'd shown 7 years ago. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it made something in my chest tighten. When we finished, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. I called our field office and requested a forensic specialist. If this man really was Adrian Kelch, we'd need to verify it. Fingerprints, dental records, anything that could prove identity beyond doubt. Dorian Glade arrived 90 minutes later. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of methodical patience that made him perfect for evidence analysis. I'd worked with him on a dozen cases. He set up his equipment in a corner of the interview room without saying much. Just gave Kelch a professional nod and got to work. The fingerprinting took 10 minutes. Glade scanned the prints directly into his laptop and ran them through the database while I watched over his shoulder. The match came back within seconds. Adrian Michael Kelch, 10-point match. Certainty, 100%. Glade looked at me, and I saw my own confusion reflected in his face. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "Run it again." He did. Same result. We tried different fingers, different angles. Every single print came back as a perfect match for Adrian Kelch. Glade pulled up the original prints from 2018 and laid them side by side with the new scans on his screen. Identical. "Agent Carrick," Glade said, keeping his voice low. "I've been doing this for 23 years. I've never seen a false positive on a 10-point match, let alone multiple matches across different fingers. This is Adrian Kelch." But it couldn't be. I'd read the accident report myself. The car had been submerged for 6 hours before the dive team reached it. The doors locked from inside. Even if Kelch had somehow escaped, even if the whole thing had been an elaborate fake, he'd have aged. 7 years should have changed him. When I went back into the interview room, Kelch was sitting in the same position, hands folded, staring at nothing. He looked up when I entered, and for just a moment I thought I saw something in his eyes. A flicker of something that wasn't quite human. "We've confirmed your identity," I told him. "You are Adrian Kelch." He nodded slowly. "I know who I am." "Then you need to explain to me how you're sitting here." "I can't," he said simply. "I wish I could." We kept him at the precinct that night. I had too many questions and no answers. The sergeant gave us access to one of their holding cells, not because Kelch was under arrest, but because I didn't know where else to put him. He didn't object, just asked for a glass of water and said he'd wait as long as we needed. I spent the next 6 hours making calls, pulling records, trying to find some rational explanation. The medical examiner's office confirmed they'd never received a body, but that wasn't unusual for an East River drowning. The current could carry remains for miles, out to sea, where they'd never be found. The vehicle recovery team sent me their photographs from 2018. The car had been in 40 feet of water, intact, no signs of forced entry. Around midnight, I went down to check on Kelch. The cell was at the end of a long hallway, away from the main booking area. When I got there, I found the officer who was supposed to be keeping watch standing outside the door, his face pale. "Agent Carrick," he said, "you need to see this." He opened the cell door. Kelch was sitting on the bench against the wall, exactly where I'd left him. But the fluorescent light above him was flickering, casting strange shadows across his face. He didn't seem to notice. "How long has the light been doing that?" I asked. "About an hour," the officer said. "I called maintenance, but they said all the lights in this wing are fine. It's just this one cell." I stepped inside. The temperature felt wrong. Not cold exactly, but empty. Like the air itself was thinner. Kelch looked up at me, and in the stuttering light his face seemed to shift. One moment he looked solid, real. The next, he seemed almost translucent, like I could see through him to the wall behind. "Mr. Kelch," I said, "how do you feel?" "Tired," he said. "It's hard to stay here." "What do you mean, stay here?" He didn't answer, just looked down at his hands again. In the flickering light, I couldn't tell if they were shaking or if it was just an illusion. I left him there and went back upstairs. Dorian Glade was still in the interview room, reviewing the fingerprint data on his laptop. He looked exhausted. "Find anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "The prints are real, Miles. I've checked them against every database we have access to. This is Adrian Kelch, but there's something else." He turned his laptop toward me. On the screen were 2 photographs of fingerprints side by side. "This is the print we took in 2018, he said, pointing to the left image. "And this is from tonight. They looked identical to me. What am I missing?" "The aging," Glade said. "Fingerprints change over time. Not the pattern itself, but the ridge detail, the depth, the clarity. These prints are identical, Miles, not similar. Identical. Down to the microscopic level. It's like no time has passed at all." "That's not possible." "I know." He closed the laptop. "But that's what the evidence shows." I thanked him and told him to go home, get some rest. He gathered his equipment and left, but I could see the unease in his posture. This case was getting under his skin the same way it was getting under mine. I found a desk in an empty office and started going through the original case files again. The witness statements, the crime scene photos, the surveillance footage from the building. Everything pointed to a straightforward mob hit. Vincent Castellano had been skimming money, and his associates had eliminated the problem. Adrian Kelch had been an accidental witness, wrong place at the wrong time. At 3 a.m, I found something I'd missed before. A security camera recording from the night Kelch's car went into the river. The footage was grainy, taken from a camera mounted on the bridge itself. It showed Kelch's Honda Civic approaching from the Manhattan side, slowing near the center span, then suddenly accelerating toward the railing. The car smashed through the barrier and disappeared into the water below. I watched it 5 times. There was no question it was Kelch's vehicle. The license plate was clearly visible. But something about the footage bothered me. I couldn't see inside the car. The windows were dark, almost black, even though the bridge lights should have illuminated the interior. I called the traffic camera division and asked them to send me the original digital file. They said it would take a few hours, that I'd have it by morning. When dawn started breaking over Queens, I went down to the holding cell again. The officer on duty said Kelch hadn't moved all night, hadn't asked for anything, hadn't slept. He just sat there in the flickering light. I opened the cell door and stepped inside. Kelch looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "Agent Carrick," he said quietly, "I don't think I can stay much longer." "What do you mean?" "The light," he said, gesturing at the stuttering fluorescent above us. "It's getting harder to be in it, to be seen." A chill ran down my spine. "Mr. Kelch, I need you to be straight with me. What happened to you 7 years ago?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I went into the water," he said. "I remember the cold, the dark. And then I was here again, but not quite here. Not quite anywhere." He looked at his hands, flexing his fingers slowly. "Sometimes I think I never came back up." We moved Kelch to a safe house in Flushing the next morning. It was a nondescript 2-story building wedged between a Chinese restaurant and a dry cleaner, the kind of place the Bureau used for witnesses who needed to disappear for a while. I had 2 agents stationed outside and another monitoring the security cameras. Whatever Kelch was, whatever had happened to him, I needed to keep him contained until I could figure it out. Dorian Glade came by around noon with more test results. We sat in the safe house's small kitchen while Kelch remained upstairs in the bedroom, away from the windows. Glade spread a series of printouts across the table. "I ran a full DNA analysis," he said, pointing to columns of data I could barely understand. "It matches samples we had on file from 2018, but there's something strange. More strange than a dead man walking," I said. He didn't smile. "The cellular degradation is wrong. DNA breaks down over time, especially if someone's been through physical trauma or environmental stress. But Kelch's DNA shows no signs of aging. It's pristine, like it was frozen in time 7 years ago." I stared at the printouts, trying to make sense of it. Could the samples be contaminated? I thought of that. I ran the tests 3 times, used different samples, same results. Glade leaned back in his chair. "Miles, I don't know what we're dealing with here, but it's not following any biological rules I understand." After he left, I went upstairs to check on Kelch. I found him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. The afternoon sun was streaming through the window, and I noticed he was sitting just outside the beam of light, in shadow. "Mr. Kelch," I said from the doorway, "do you mind if I ask you some questions?" He turned slowly. "Of course." I pulled a chair from the corner and sat down, keeping some distance between us. "Tell me about the threats you received back in 2018, before you agreed to protective custody." "Phone calls," he said. "Always at night. They told me to forget what I saw, that I'd have an accident if I didn't. Standard intimidation. Did you recognize the voices?" "No. They were always muffled, like someone was holding cloth over the phone." "And the night you drove into the river, do you remember that?" His face went blank for a moment. "Yes and no. I remember being afraid. I remember thinking I needed to get away, that nowhere was safe. I remember getting in the car, starting to drive." He paused, his eyes distant. "After that, it's confused. Dark, cold, and then waking up, but not waking up. Being here, but not being here. Mr. Kelch, I need you to think very carefully. Is there any possibility someone drugged you that night? Forced you off the bridge?" "I don't think so, but I can't be sure." He looked at me directly. "Agent Carrick, do you believe in things that can't be explained?" The question caught me off guard. "I believe in evidence. That's not what I asked." I stood up, walked to the window. Outside, the street was busy with afternoon traffic, people going about their normal lives. "I believe there are things we don't understand yet. That doesn't make them supernatural. Then how do you explain me?" I didn't have an answer for that. That evening, I received the digital file from the traffic camera division. I loaded it onto my laptop and watched the bridge footage again, this time with better resolution. The Honda Civic approached from Manhattan, slowed near the center span, then suddenly veered toward the railing. But something was different in this version. As the car broke through the barrier just for a single frame, I could see through the windshield. The driver's seat was empty. I paused the footage, rewound it, watched it again, frame by frame. The car accelerated. The driver's seat was occupied. The car hit the railing. The driver's seat was empty. The car disappeared into the water. I sat back, my heart pounding. It had to be a glitch in the footage, a blur from the speed of the impact. But I'd seen enough surveillance video in my career to know what a glitch looked like. This wasn't that. I called Dorian Glade. He was at home, but he answered on the second ring. "Dorian, I need you to analyze some footage. Can you come back to the safe house? Oh? Oh. He arrived 30 minutes later. I showed him the bridge video, pointed out the frame that bothered me. He loaded it into his analysis software and started breaking it down, examining each frame in sequence. After 20 minutes, he looked up at me. Miles, there's no evidence of tampering. This is the original footage, no edits, no manipulation. Then what am I seeing? What we're both seeing. He ran the sequence again, this time in extreme slow motion. The driver is there, and then he's not. Between these two frames, he vanishes. That's physically impossible. Everything about this case is physically impossible. Glade closed his laptop. I think we need to consider the possibility that whatever we have upstairs isn't entirely Adrian Kelch, or isn't only Adrian Kelch. What are you saying? I'm saying the evidence doesn't support a living human being. The lack of aging, the DNA preservation, this footage. It's like we're dealing with a recording, an echo. I wanted to dismiss it, to find some rational explanation that made sense. But every piece of evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Adrian Kelch had died 7 years ago, and what came back wasn't quite alive. Late that night, I was sitting in the safe house's living room going through case files when I heard something from upstairs. A voice, low and rhythmic. I grabbed my service weapon and climbed the stairs slowly. The sound was coming from Kelch's room. The door was ajar. I pushed it open carefully and saw Kelch sitting on the floor in the corner, his back against the wall. He was speaking, but not in English. The words were unfamiliar, almost mechanical. The same phrase, over and over. "Mr. Kelch?" He didn't respond, just kept repeating those strange words, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I holstered my weapon and approached slowly. "Mr. Kelch, can you hear me?" The repetition stopped. He looked up at me, and his eyes were different, darker. "I'm sorry, Agent Carrick. Sometimes I forget where I am." "What were you saying?" "I don't know." He pulled himself up, using the wall for support. "It's like there's static in my head, words that aren't mine." I helped him back to the bed. His skin was cold to the touch, like he'd been standing outside in winter. "You need to tell me the truth. All of it. What really happened 7 years ago?" He sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped. "I told you what I remember, but there's more. Things I see sometimes when I close my eyes. The water, yes, but also a room. White walls. Voices asking me questions. And then nothing. Just dark for a long time. Until I woke up in Queens 3 days ago, sitting on a bench near the precinct with no idea how I got there. What kind of questions? About the Castellano case, what I saw, who I'd talked to. They wanted to know everything." His hands were shaking. "I think they killed me, Agent Carrick. I think they drowned me, and somehow I came back wrong." I wanted to tell him that was impossible, that people don't come back from death. But looking at him in that moment, with the streetlight from outside casting half his face in shadow, I wasn't sure anymore. The next morning, I got a call from our field office. There had been a development in the Castellano case. One of the men Kelch had described, a Genovese associate named Frank Terranova, had been found dead in his car in Brooklyn. Single gunshot to the head, same as Castellano. No witnesses, no evidence. I asked when it happened. The night before, around the same time Kelch had been sitting in the corner, repeating those strange words. I drove to Brooklyn to see the crime scene. Terranova's body was still in his Lincoln Continental, parked in an alley behind a social club on Court Street. The forensics team was processing the vehicle when I arrived. I showed my credentials and asked to take a look. Terranova had been shot through the driver's side window at close range. Powder burns on his skin suggested the gun had been inches from his head. The bullet had exited through the passenger window and lodged in the brick wall of the building. Standard execution, professional work. But something caught my eye. On the dashboard, written in what looked like condensation on the windshield, were words. They were fading fast in the morning sun, but I could just make them out. The same phrase Kelch had been repeating the night before. I took photographs before the words disappeared completely, then called Dorian Glade and had him meet me at the safe house. When I arrived, I found the 2 agents I'd left on duty standing outside, looking shaken. "Agent Carrick," one of them said, "something's wrong with the witness." I ran upstairs. Kelch's room was empty. The window was still locked from the inside. The door to the hallway had been monitored all night. There was no way out, but Adrian Kelch was gone. We searched the entire building, the neighboring properties, the surrounding blocks. No sign of him. It was like he'd simply vanished into thin air. The security footage showed nothing. One moment the camera recorded an empty hallway outside his room. The next moment the feed went dark for exactly 6 seconds. When it came back, everything looked the same. But Kelch was already gone. Dorian Glade arrived and examined the room. He dusted for prints, collected samples, analyzed every inch of the space. After 2 hours, he came downstairs with a puzzled expression. "Miles, there's no physical evidence that Kelch left through conventional means. The window's still locked. No disturbance of the dust on the sill. But there's something else." He showed me his laptop. On the screen was a thermal image taken from one of our cameras. "This is from last night around 3 a.m. Look at Kelch's heat signature." I studied the image. The figure sitting on the bed should have shown up as bright red and orange, indicating normal body heat. Instead, it was pale blue, the same temperature as the room around it. "He's cold," I said. "Colder than cold. He's ambient temperature, like he wasn't generating any heat at all." Glade scrolled through more images. "And look at this. His signature gets fainter over time. By 5 a.m., you can barely distinguish him from the background." "What does that mean?" "It means whatever we were holding wasn't alive in any biological sense." He closed the laptop. "I think he was fading, Miles. Disappearing. And last night, he finally ran out of whatever energy was keeping him visible." I went back upstairs and stood in the empty room. The afternoon light was streaming through the window now, illuminating dust motes in the air. I thought about Kelch sitting in this space, slowly becoming less real, less there, fighting to maintain some kind of existence in a world that had already let him go. On the wall opposite the bed, I noticed something I'd missed before. Scratch marks, faint but deliberate, forming letters. I can't stay in the light. The Bureau wanted to close the case. As far as they were concerned, we'd been chasing a ghost. Literally or figuratively, it didn't matter. Adrian Kelch's fingerprints were real, his DNA was real, but the man himself had vanished, and there was no reasonable way to explain any of it. The brass decided it was better to file everything away and forget it happened, but I couldn't let it go. Frank Terranova's murder bothered me. The timing was too precise, the method too similar to Castellano's execution, and those words on the windshield, the same phrase Kelch had been repeating in his room, suggested a connection I couldn't ignore. I spent the next week digging into the original case files, looking for anything I might have missed 7 years ago. I re-interviewed witnesses, tracked down associates of both Castellano and Terranova, searched for any link between them and Kelch beyond the obvious. What I found was a pattern. In the months after Kelch's car went into the East River, 3 other Genovese associates connected to the Castellano hit had died under suspicious circumstances. One fell from his apartment balcony, Another overdosed on heroin despite having no history of drug use. The third crashed his car into a concrete barrier on the Hutchinson River Parkway. No witnesses to any of them. All ruled accidents or suicide. And now Terra Nova, 7 years later, shot in the same manner as Castellano. I called the lead detective on each case, asked if there had been anything unusual about the investigations. Most of them gave me nothing. Standard deaths, standard procedures, but the detective who'd worked the Parkway crash mentioned something that made my skin crawl. There was something weird about the scene, he said. The car was totaled, wrapped around the barrier. But when we pulled the driver out, his body was cold. Not fresh dead cold, like he'd been sitting in a freezer. Medical examiner said it was just the temperature that night, but I don't know. It felt wrong. After I hung up, I sat in my office and stared at the caseboard I'd constructed. Photographs of all the dead men. Timelines, connections drawn in red marker. In the center was Adrian Kelch's photo from 2018, his face calm and unremarkable. I thought about what Dorian Glade had said. An echo, a recording playing itself out. What if Kelch hadn't come back to testify? What if he'd come back to finish something he'd started? That night, I returned to the 114th precinct and asked to see the holding cell where we'd first kept Kelch. The sergeant on duty let me in, though he seemed reluctant. Some of the officers don't like going down there anymore, he said. They say the lights still flicker. I walked down the hallway alone. The precinct was quiet, most of the day shift gone home. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and bright. But when I reached Kelch's cell at the end of the hall, the light inside was stuttering, casting rapid shadows across the empty space. I stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, that same empty coldness I'd felt before. On the bench where Kelch had sat, I could see a faint outline in the dust, as if someone had been there recently. But no one had used this cell in days. I took out my phone and started recording video, panning slowly around the space. On the playback, I could see something I couldn't see with my naked eyes. A distortion in the air near the bench, like heat shimmer, but cold. It flickered in time with the malfunctioning light. I backed out of the cell and called Dorian Glade. I need you to bring your thermal camera to the 114th precinct, now. He arrived 40 minutes later. We set up his equipment in the cell, recording thermal and video simultaneously. What we captured made both of us fall silent. The thermal camera showed a figure sitting on the bench. Pale blue, barely distinguishable from the background but unmistakably human-shaped. It didn't move, didn't react to our presence, just sat there in the flickering light. "Is that him?" Glade whispered. "I think it's a residue," I said. "Like a stain, something left behind." We watched for 20 minutes. The figure never moved. But then, so faintly I almost missed it, I heard a voice. The same words Kelch had been repeating. The same phrase from Terra Nova's windshield. I pulled out my phone and recorded the audio. Later, I'd send it to a translator, someone who could identify the language. But even then, standing in that cold cell with Dorian beside me, I had a sinking feeling I knew what it meant. The translator got back to me the next day. The phrase was in Italian, old dialect, barely recognizable. It translated roughly to, "The debt is paid." I thought about the men who'd died, all of them connected to Castellano's murder, all of them responsible, in some way, for what happened to Adrian Kelch. And now, 7 years after his death, something was still settling accounts. I went back to the safe house in Flushing, even though I knew Kelch wouldn't be there. The agents had cleared out. The building returned to its usual anonymous emptiness. I stood in the room where Kelch had stayed, looking at those scratch marks on the wall. I can't stay in the light. It made sense now. Whatever had come back wasn't meant for the living world. It existed in shadows, in cold spaces, in the gaps between moments. The light, real light, warm and alive, was painful to it, unsustainable. But in the dark, in the cold, it could act, it could move, it could finish what needed to be finished. I pulled the Castellano case files one more time and made a list of everyone involved. Every associate, every witness, every person who'd known about the hit. Most of them were dead or in prison. But there were 2 names left, 2 men who'd been suspected but never charged. Vincent DeLuca and Anthony Rossi. Both Genovese soldiers. Both connected to the Castellano murder through wiretaps and informant testimony, but never enough evidence to prosecute. I tried to call them, to warn them. DeLuca's phone went straight to voicemail. Rossi's number was disconnected. I drove to DeLuca's last known address, an apartment in the Bronx. The super let me in after I showed my credentials. The apartment was empty, cleaned out, but in the bedroom, I found something that made my blood run cold. The same words, written in dust on the mirror. The debt is paid. Vincent DeLuca's body was found 3 days later in a stolen car in Jersey City. Shot through the head at close range. No witnesses. No evidence except powder burns and a 9mm bullet that matched no weapon in any database. Anthony Rossi disappeared the same week. His credit cards stopped being used. His cell phone went dark. No one saw him leave his home in Staten Island, but when police finally entered, they found the house empty. And in his basement office, on the wall above his desk, those same words scratched into the paint. The debt is paid. The last time I saw anything I could attribute to Adrian Kelch was 3 weeks after Rossi vanished. I was working late in my office at Federal Plaza, reviewing reports, when the lights in my section flickered. Just once, a quick stutter. I looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. He looked different than before. More transparent, like I was seeing him through frosted glass. His features were blurred, indistinct, but his eyes, those were clear. They met mine with something that might have been recognition or might have been goodbye. "Mr. Kelch," I said, standing up slowly. "Are you really there?" He didn't answer, just stood there in the doorway, flickering in and out of sight with the rhythm of the fluorescent lights. Then he opened his mouth and I heard that phrase one more time, whispered so quietly I almost missed it. "The debt is paid." And then he was gone. The lights steadied, the doorway was empty, and when I checked the security cameras later, there was nothing. Just 6 seconds of darkness, the same gap that had appeared in the safe house footage. I never saw Adrian Kelch again, but sometimes, late at night, I'll be reviewing old cases and the lights will flicker. Just once. And I'll feel that cold, empty air around me, the sensation of something passing through on its way to somewhere else. The Castellano case officially closed 6 months after Kelch's final disappearance. The brass were satisfied that all loose ends had been tied up one way or another. The men responsible for witness intimidation and murder were dead. Justice had been served, even if the method was unorthodox. I kept the case file in my desk drawer. Sometimes I'd pull it out late at night and go through it again, searching for some detail I might have missed, some rational explanation for what had happened. But there was never anything new. Just the same impossible facts, the same evidence that defied explanation. Dorian Glade transferred to the Seattle field office 8 months after the case closed. We'd have coffee occasionally before he left, talk about other cases, normal investigations. But we never discussed Adrian Kelch. It was as if some unspoken agreement existed between us that certain things were better left unexamined. The night before his transfer, Glade stopped by my office with something in his hand. A small evidence bag containing a single item, the audio recording I'd made in the precinct cell, the whispered phrase in Italian. "I had it analyzed one more time," he said, setting it on my desk. "By a specialist in acoustic forensics. He found something in the background noise underneath the voice." "What kind of something?" "Water," Glade said. "The sound of water moving fast, like a river. And something else, a car alarm, the same model as Kelch's Honda, playing on loop, over and over." We looked at each other for a long moment. "He's still down there," I said quietly, "in the East River. Whatever came back, whatever we saw, it wasn't separate from his body. It was connected, tethered." Glade nodded. "That's what I think, too. The real Adrian Kelch died 7 years ago. What came back was something else, an echo of his last thoughts, his last intentions, running on guilt and anger and unfinished business." After he left, I sat alone in my office and thought about that. About a man who'd done the right thing, who'd tried to testify, who'd been killed for it. And about whatever force or mystery allowed him to come back. Not fully, not alive, but enough to finish what he'd started. I thought about DeLuca and Rossi and Terranova and all the others. About their families, who'd never know what really happened, who'd bury their dead with unanswered questions. About justice served through channels no court would recognize. A few months later, I was working a new case, something routine involving bank fraud. I needed to review some old surveillance footage from a building in Queens, and I found myself near the 114th precinct. On impulse, I stopped in, asked to see that holding cell one more time. The sergeant remembered me. "The cell with the bad light? Yeah, it's still there. We don't use it anymore. Too many complaints." He led me down the familiar hallway. The fluorescent above the cell was still flickering, that same irregular pattern. I stepped inside and immediately felt that cold, empty air. But something was different. The cold wasn't as intense. The flickering seemed slower, less urgent. I pulled out my phone and recorded thermal video like I'd done before. The figure on the bench was still there, but fainter now, nearly transparent even on the thermal camera. Fading. I watched it for a while. This remnant of Adrian Kelch slowly disappearing from the world. Whatever debt he'd felt obligated to pay was settled. Whatever tether had held him here was finally loosening. Before I left, I did something I couldn't quite explain. I spoke to the empty cell, to the fading figure I could only see through a camera. "Thank you," I said, "for finishing it, for not letting them get away with it." The flickering stopped for just a moment. The light held steady, and then resumed its irregular pattern. I never went back to that cell again, but I heard from other officers that eventually, about a year later, the light stopped flickering. It just worked normally one day, like it had never been broken. Some said maintenance finally fixed it. But I knew better. Adrian Kelch was finally truly gone. I still keep the case file in my desk, not as an active investigation, but as a reminder that sometimes justice takes forms we don't understand, that sometimes the answers we seek are beyond the reach of evidence and procedure. And sometimes, when I'm working late and the office is empty, the lights will flicker, just once. And I'll look up expecting to see him standing there in the doorway, that blurred figure from beyond death. But there's never anything there, just shadows and fluorescent hum and the ordinary darkness of a New York night. Still, I find myself listening, waiting for that whispered phrase in Italian, the sound of old debts being settled in ways no living person could manage. Because I learned something from the Kelch case, something that stayed with me through all the years since. Some things refuse to stay buried. Some wrongs demand correction, even from beyond the grave. And sometimes the line between justice and vengeance becomes so thin that it disappears entirely, leaving only the cold certainty that accounts must be balanced. The last entry in the Castellano case file is a single sentence I added myself, written in the margin of the final report. Witness deceased. Testimony complete. It's the only true thing I can say about what happened. Adrian Kelch died in 2018 when his car went into the East River. But his testimony continued for 7 more years, delivered not in a courtroom but in darkened alleys and empty cars, spoken not in English but in the universal language of final judgment. I've never told anyone the full story. This report exists only in my personal files, not in any official bureau database. Because how do you explain to a supervisor that you spent months tracking a ghost? That you collected evidence of the impossible? That you watched justice be served by something that shouldn't exist? You don't. You file it away, mark it closed, and move on to cases that make sense. But late at night, when the city is quiet and the office lights cast long shadows, I think about Adrian Kelch, about the man who was too brave for his own good, who tried to do the right thing and paid for it with his life, and about what came after, the thing that wore his face, carried his memories, and refused to let his death be meaningless. There's a photograph I keep tucked into the case file. It's from the security camera at the 114th precinct, taken the morning Kelch first walked in. He's standing at the front desk talking to the sergeant, and just for a moment, he's looking directly at the camera. His expression is calm, resolved. He knows what he's come to do. But if you look closely at the photograph, you can see something else. The shadow he casts on the floor behind him is wrong. It's too long, too dark, stretching back toward the exit, like it's trying to pull him away. Like even then, some part of him knew he didn't belong in the light anymore. I look at that photograph sometimes and wonder, did Adrian Kelch really come back? Or did something else, something that existed in the cold and the dark, use his form to accomplish what he couldn't finish in life? Was it justice or something more ancient, more primal? Revenge dressed up in the clothes of a dead man? I don't have answers. The evidence is contradictory, impossible, defying every rule of logic and science. Adrian Kelch is dead. Adrian Kelch came back. Both statements are true. Both statements are verified by fingerprints, DNA, surveillance footage, and witness testimony. The paradox is perfect, unsolvable. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be understood, only witnessed. Maybe the universe has rules we don't know yet, allowances made for debts so profound that not even death can prevent their collection. All I know for certain is this. On a cold morning in Queens, a dead man walked into a police station and asked to finish his testimony. And before he faded back into whatever darkness had carried him, he made sure every person responsible for his death paid the same price he did. The debt is paid. Those words still echo in my head sometimes, whispered in that strange hollow voice. I'll be falling asleep and I'll hear them, faint as breath on a cold window. And I'll wonder if Adrian Kelch is truly gone, or if some thin residue of him still exists, caught in the space between the living world and whatever comes after. Last week, I got a call from the dive team that works the East River. They'd been doing routine training exercises near the Queensboro Bridge when they found something. A Honda Civic, submerged in 45 feet of water, covered in silt and river growth. The license plate matched Adrian Kelch's vehicle from 2018. But here's the thing. We'd already recovered that car 7 years ago. I'd seen the photographs, read the reports. That Honda had been pulled from the water, processed, and eventually scrapped. Yet here was another one, in almost the exact same location, buried in sediment that suggested it had been there for at least a decade. The dive team asked if I wanted them to bring it up. I told them no. Some things are better left where they are, in the cold and the dark, where they belong. Because I've learned that the East River keeps its secrets, and some of those secrets come back when they choose to, not when we call them. Adrian Kelch is in that car, and he's not. He's in that flickering cell at the 114th precinct, and he's not. He's standing in doorways throughout the city, a cold presence felt but never quite seen, settling accounts that were 7 years overdue. Or he's nowhere at all, just a story I tell myself to make sense of things that have no sense. Just a case file that should have been closed but never quite can be. I don't know anymore. And after everything I've seen, everything I've documented and witnessed and tried to understand, I've made peace with not knowing. Some debts transcend death. Some testimony gets delivered regardless of whether the witness is alive to give it. And sometimes, late at night in a Manhattan office building, the lights flicker and a cold wind passes through, and you realize that the boundary between here and gone is thinner than you ever wanted to believe. Adrian Kelch came back to finish what he started. And when his work was done, he returned to the cold water that had claimed him, leaving behind only questions and flickering lights and the unsettling certainty that justice, when denied, finds its own way forward. The debt is paid. The testimony is complete. The case is closed. But I still keep that evidence bag in my desk drawer, the audio recording with the whispered Italian and the sound of water underneath. And sometimes, when the office is empty and the city sleeps, I'll play it back and listen to that hollow voice speaking words of finality from beyond the grave. And I'll think about Adrian Kelch, wherever he is now, dissolved into river water and darkness and the cold space between moments. Still watching, still waiting, still ensuring that those who escape justice in life don't escape it forever. Because that's what I learned from this case. That's what keeps me awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle around me. Death is not always the end. Sometimes it's just a different beginning, a different kind of testimony, a different way of making sure the truth gets told. And in the flickering lights and cold corners of this city, in the spaces where the living world meets something else, Adrian Kelch is still speaking, still witnessing, still ensuring that debts are paid in full, even if no one living can hear him anymore, even if he's nothing but an echo, fading a little more each day. The lights just flickered in my office. Just once, barely noticeable. And for a moment, I could have sworn I felt that familiar cold, that empty air that signals something passing through. But when I looked up, the doorway was empty. The hallway beyond was silent. The building settled back into its normal sounds. HVAC, distant traffic, the hum of late-night maintenance. Just my imagination, probably. A draft from the ventilation system. The power grid cycling, or maybe Adrian Kelch making his final rounds, saying goodbye to the one person who tried to understand what happened to him. I'll never know for sure, and maybe that's exactly how it should be. The evidence locker at 26 Federal Plaza runs 24 hours a day, but nobody likes the night shift. I learned that my first week with the Manhattan field office, watching how the senior agents traded favors and pulled strings to avoid working past midnight. They said it was the fluorescent lights, the lack of windows, the way sound echoed off concrete walls at 3 a.m. But I knew better. I'd been in the bureau long enough to recognize superstition dressed up as preference. My name is Eleonora Finch, and I've been an FBI agent for 9 years. Before that, I spent 6 years as a forensic accountant, following money trails through shell corporations and offshore accounts. Numbers don't lie, my first supervisor used to say. They tell stories that witnesses can't or won't. But sometimes, evidence tells stories nobody wants to hear. It started on a Tuesday in November. I was working a fraud case, tracking cryptocurrency transactions for a Ponzi scheme operating out of Brighton Beach. The kind of tedious work that requires silence and concentration, which is why I volunteered for the overnight shift in the evidence room. Less distraction, fewer interruptions. I was at my desk, spreadsheets covering 2 monitors, when Carmine Bellotti appeared with a cardboard box. Carmine was the evidence clerk, a short man in his 60s with careful hands, and the kind of methodical personality that made him perfect for the job. He'd been with the Bureau since '95, longer than most of the agents currently in the building. "Got something for you, Agent Finch," he said, setting the box on the corner of my desk. "Just came up from the Bronx field office. Homicide case, 3 months old." I didn't look up from my screen. "Why's it coming here?" "Victims' financials. Thought you might find something relevant." He paused. "Mind if I work in here tonight? Storage bay's temperature control is acting up again, and I need to recatalog some items before they degrade." "Sure," I said, still focused on tracking a series of wallet addresses through the blockchain. "Quiet company's fine." He settled at a desk across the room with his own box of materials, and we worked in companionable silence for the next few hours. The building's HVAC hummed overhead. Somewhere distant, a security guard's radio crackled. Normal sounds, familiar sounds. Around midnight, I finally looked at the box Carmine had brought. The case file was clipped to the outside. Homicide. Victim identified as Marcus Treadwell, 34. Found in his Fordham apartment on August 15th. Shot twice in the chest. Estimated time of death between 11:30 p.m. and midnight. No forced entry. No witnesses. No suspects. I opened the box and started cataloging the contents. Wallet, cell phone, laptop, various personal effects. Standard evidence collection. Then, at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic evidence bag, I found a wristwatch. It was an old Timex, the kind with a brown leather band and a simple analog face. The crystal was cracked, and the leather was worn smooth from years of use. According to the evidence tag, it had been found on the victim's nightstand. Stopped at 11:47 p.m. I picked up the bag to examine it more closely, and that's when I felt it. A vibration, faint but distinct, like the watch was running inside the sealed plastic. I held it up to the light. The second hand was moving. "Carmine," I said, keeping my voice level, "did anyone wind this watch before it was logged?" He looked up from his work. "What watch?" I showed him the evidence bag. Through the plastic, we could both see the second hand sweeping smoothly around the face, marking off time that shouldn't exist. Carmine stood and walked over, his expression troubled. "That's not possible. I processed that evidence myself when it came in from the Bronx. The watch was stopped. I noted it specifically. 11:47 p.m., same time as the estimated death." We both watched the second hand complete another circuit. Then another. The movement was smooth, mechanical, normal. Except the watch should have needed winding, should have been as dead as the man who'd worn it. "Maybe the movement got jarred when I picked it up," I said, more to convince myself than Carmine. "Old watches can be temperamental." "Sure," Carmine said, but he was still staring at it. "That must be it." He went back to his desk, and I set the evidence bag aside, returning to my cryptocurrency trails. But I couldn't stop glancing at it. The watch kept running, the second hand maintaining its steady pace, tick, 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 through the silence of the evidence room. At 12:15 a.m., I picked up the evidence bag again and looked at the watch face. It now read 12:02 a.m., not the current time. The watch was running fast, or I was running slow. I checked my phone. 12:15 a.m. Exactly. The watch was wrong. but it was running. I made a note in my case log, photographed the watch through the plastic, and returned to my financial analysis. Just a quirk of an old timepiece, nothing more. Evidence rooms were full of strange items, objects that had witnessed violence or betrayal or death. Sometimes they carried a weight that felt heavier than their physical mass. Psychological projection, nothing more. But when I looked up 20 minutes later, the watch had stopped again. The second hand was frozen at 11:47 p.m. I stared at it for a long moment, then checked my phone. 12:35 a.m. I'd been watching the watch run just minutes ago. There was no way the spring had wound down that quickly. No mechanical explanation for it stopping at the exact same time it had stopped before. "Carmine," I said quietly, "what time did Marcus Treadwell die?" He pulled up the case file on his computer. Me estimated between 11:30 and midnight. Why? The watch stopped at 11:47. Right. That's noted in the evidence report. Probably stopped when he fell, impact from hitting the floor. It was just running. I saw it. You saw it. He looked at me, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not disbelief. Recognition. Like he'd seen something similar before and didn't want to acknowledge it. "I'll make a note in the log," he said finally. "Possible malfunction in the watch mechanism. We should have a horologist examine it." But we both knew that wasn't what we'd witnessed. The rest of the shift passed without incident. I finished my analysis of the cryptocurrency transactions, wrote up my report, and prepared to head home when the day shift arrived at 7 a.m. As I packed my bag, I glanced at the evidence box one more time. The watch was still stopped at 11:47 p.m. I mentioned it to my partner, Rex Standish, when we met for our regular Thursday briefing. Rex was a 20-year veteran, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair, and the kind of calm authority that came from seeing everything at least once. We'd been partnered for 2 years, and I trusted his judgment more than almost anyone else in the bureau. "So you're telling me a watch started running on its own, then stopped at the same time the victim died?" he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. We were at a diner on 3rd Avenue, our usual spot for case discussions away from the office. I know how it sounds. It sounds like a mechanical issue with an old watch. He took a sip, studying me over the rim of his cup. "But you don't think that's what it was?" "I don't know what it was. But Carmine saw it too. We both watched the second hand moving." Rex was quiet for a moment. "You want my advice? Document it and move on. Strange things happen in evidence rooms. Objects end up in places they shouldn't. Items go missing then reappear. Most of it's got rational explanations. Human error, mislabeling, contamination. The rest," he shrugged, "the rest you learn to live with. Has something like this happened to you?" "Once," he said slowly. "About 10 years ago. Drug case. Dealer got shot in a motel room in Newark. When we processed the scene, his phone was dead. Battery completely drained. But every day at the time he died, that phone would light up in the evidence locker. Just for a few seconds, a screen would glow, then go dark again. Happened for 2 weeks, then stopped. What did you do?" "Noted it in the file. Had the tech guys examine it. They found nothing wrong with the hardware. Eventually wrote it off as a malfunction." He met my eyes. "But I was there when it happened, Eleonora. I saw that screen light up with no power source, no logical reason. And I learned that sometimes evidence doesn't want to stay quiet." I thought about that conversation all day. That night, I returned to the evidence room for another overnight shift. Carmine wasn't there. He'd swapped shifts with someone, according to the schedule. I had the room to myself, just me and several thousand pieces of evidence from cases active and cold. I tried to focus on my work, but I kept thinking about the watch. Around 10 p.m., I pulled the Marcus Treadwell evidence box from the shelf and set it on my desk. The watch was still in its evidence bag, still stopped at 11:47 p.m. I photographed it again, documenting the current state for my records. Then I set up my phone to record video, pointing the camera at the watch. If it started running again, I wanted proof, something more than my word and Carmine's. The minutes crawled by. 10:30, 11 o'clock, 11:30. At 11:45 p.m., the second hand began to move. I watched, barely breathing, as the hand swept smoothly around the face. Tick, tick, tick. The sound audible even through the plastic bag. The watch ran for exactly 2 minutes. I could see the minute hand shift incrementally as the seconds accumulated. Then, at 11:47 p.m., the actual time, matching my phone's clock, the watch stopped. The second hand froze mid-sweep. The mechanism went silent. The watch was dead again. Stopped at the exact moment Marcus Treadwell had been shot 3 months earlier. I played back the video on my phone. The footage was clear, undeniable. The watch had started at 11:45 and stopped at 11:47, running for exactly 2 minutes before dying at the moment of the murder. My hands were shaking as I saved the file and backed it up to 3 different locations. This was evidence of something, though I didn't know what. A malfunction, maybe. Some peculiarity in the watch's mechanism that caused it to briefly function at a specific time each night. Except it was the exact time of death, and it ran for exactly 2 minutes, then stopped precisely when the victim had died. I sat there in the silent evidence room, surrounded by the accumulated debris of violence and crime, and realized that Rex was right. Sometimes evidence doesn't want to stay quiet. Sometimes it keeps talking long after the case is closed, telling stories in ways that shouldn't be possible. The question was, what story was Marcus Treadwell's watch trying to tell? I spent the next week obsessing over the Marcus Treadwell case. During the day, I worked my assigned cases, the cryptocurrency fraud, a wire transfer scheme, a money laundering operation in Chinatown. But at night, alone in the evidence room, I focused on the watch. I documented everything. Every night at 11:45 p.m., the watch would start running. Every night at 11:47 p.m., it would stop. The cycle never varied. I recorded video, took detailed notes, measured the temperature and humidity in the room. Nothing explained it. Carmine noticed my preoccupation. On Friday night, he brought me coffee and sat down at the desk across from mine. "You're still thinking about that watch," he said. It wasn't a question. "It keeps running," I told him. "Every night, same time." He nodded slowly, his weathered face troubled. "I've been working in evidence storage for 26 years. I've seen things I can't explain. Objects that move on their own. Items that appear in locations they were never logged into. Once, a recording from a crime scene started playing by itself, same section looping over and over." He paused. "The Bureau doesn't like us talking about it. Makes us sound unstable. But it happens. It happens," he confirmed. "Usually with violent cases, murders mostly. Like the objects carry something from the crime scene, something that doesn't want to be filed away and forgotten." "Do you believe that? That objects can carry, what, memory, intent?" Carmine sipped his coffee, considering. "I don't know what I believe, but I know what I've seen. And I know that watch bothers me more than most things that have come through here." After he left, I pulled up the Treadwell case file again and read through it more carefully. Marcus Treadwell had been a high school math teacher in the Bronx, unmarried, no children. Neighbors described him as quiet, friendly, kept to himself. No criminal record, no known enemies. His apartment showed no signs of struggle or forced entry, suggesting he'd let his killer inside. The detective assigned to the case, a 20-year NYPD veteran named Thomas Wexler, had concluded it was likely a robbery gone wrong. Treadwell's wallet had been emptied of cash, and his laptop was missing. But nothing else had been taken. No jewelry, no electronics except the laptop. The watch had been left on his nightstand, apparently worthless to the killer. I called Detective Wexler the next morning. He remembered the case immediately. "Treadwell," he said over the phone, his voice rough from years of cigarettes. "Yeah, that one still bothers me. Clean guy, no obvious motive, no suspects. We interviewed everyone in his building. All his colleagues, his family. Nobody had a bad word to say about him." The evidence report mentions his watch was stopped at 11:47. Was that significant? Not particularly. Watches stop all the time in violent encounters. Impact, movement, whatever. The ME put time of death around that same window, so it lined up. Why? You working the case? Just reviewing some evidence. Did you ever identify any suspects? We had a few persons of interest. Treadwell's ex-boyfriend, for one. Guy named Stephen Wick. They'd broken up about 6 months before the murder. Bitter split, according to friends. Wick had an alibi, though. Said he was at a bar in Hell's Kitchen that night. We verified it with security footage, credit card receipts. He was there from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m., solid. Anyone else? A colleague at the school. Woman named Patricia Morris. She and Treadwell had a dispute about department funding. Got pretty heated, apparently. But she was home with her husband that night, confirmed. After that, we ran dry. No physical evidence, no DNA, no witnesses. Case went cold after 3 months. After I hung up, I sat at my desk thinking. A murder with no obvious suspects, no clear motive, no physical evidence beyond the victim's body and the spent bullets. Just another statistic in a city full of unsolved crimes. And a watch that kept running at the exact moment of death. That night, I was in the evidence room at 11:30, watching the clock. Rex Standish had agreed to join me, curious to see the phenomenon for himself. He sat across from me, arms folded, expression skeptical but open. "If nothing happens," he said, "you're buying breakfast. Deal." At 11:45, the second hand on Marcus Treadwell's watch began to move. Rex leaned forward, his skepticism evaporating. Jesus Christ. We watched in silence as the watch ran its 2-minute cycle. The second hand swept smoothly around the face. The mechanical movement steady and precise. At 11:47, it stopped, freezing mid-rotation. Rex reached for the evidence bag, held it up to the light. "This is sealed, right? Nobody's tampered with it?" "Sealed, since it was logged 3 months ago. I've been documenting it every night. Same pattern, same times." He set the bag down carefully like it might explode. "This is going in my report. Command needs to know about this." But when we tried to escalate it, we hit bureaucratic walls. The assistant director wasn't interested in anomalous evidence behavior. The forensics lab said they were too backlogged to examine a watch from a cold case. Even the detective on the original case, when I called him back, told me to stop wasting his time with paranormal bullshit. "Nobody wants to deal with it," Rex said, after our third attempt to get someone to pay attention. "They're hoping if they ignore it long enough, it'll go away. It's not going away. It keeps happening. Then document everything and wait. Eventually, something will break." He was right, though not in the way either of us expected. 2 weeks after I first noticed the watch running, the surveillance cameras in the evidence room started malfunctioning. The footage would be clear, normal, then suddenly cut to black for a few seconds before resuming. It always happened at the same time. 11:47 p.m. The IT department was baffled. They checked the cameras, the servers, the power supply. Everything was functioning normally. But every night, at the exact moment Marcus Treadwell had died, the cameras went dark for 6 to 8 seconds. "It's spreading," Carmine said quietly when I told him. "Whatever's happening with that watch, it's affecting other systems now." "That's not possible. Electronic interference from a mechanical watch, it makes no sense. None of this makes sense. But it's happening." I started staying later, arriving earlier, watching not just the watch but everything around it. The evidence room felt different now, colder. The fluorescent light seemed dimmer near the shelf where Treadwell's box was stored. Other agents avoided that section, though none of them could articulate why. And then, 3 weeks after I'd first seen the watch move, I noticed something new. The case file had changed. Not dramatically. Nothing that would jump out at a casual reader. But I'd been through that file so many times I'd memorized every detail. And now, looking at the ME's report, I saw something different. The estimated time of death had been 11:30 p.m. to midnight. I was sure of it. I'd read it dozens of times. But the report now said 11:45 to 12 o'clock. I checked my own notes, my photographs of the original documents. In every photo, the time range was 11:30 to midnight, but the physical document in the file now read 11:45. I showed it to Rex. He pulled up the digital copy of the ME's report from the NYPD database. It matched the physical document, 11:45 to 12 o'clock. "You must have misread it," he said, but his tone was uncertain. "I didn't misread it. Look at my photographs. Look at the date stamps." We compared everything. My documentation clearly showed the original time range, but every official copy, physical and digital, now reflected the later time. "This is impossible," Rex said flatly. "Time of death estimates don't change, especially not in closed case files. But they have." That night, I set up multiple cameras focused on the case file itself, not just the watch. I documented every page, every detail, time-stamping everything. Then I sat and waited. At 11:45, the watch started running. At 11:47, it stopped. And in the space between those 2 minutes, while the surveillance cameras went dark, something changed. When I checked the file afterward, another detail had shifted. The description of the entry wound had been slightly reworded, not enough to change the meaning, but enough to be noticeable if you were looking for it. And when I compared it to my earlier photographs, I could see the original language was different. The case file was rewriting itself. Slowly, subtly, details were changing, and each change seemed to pull the official record closer to the watch's timing, as if the watch was somehow pulling reality toward itself, adjusting the past to match its frozen moment. I documented everything and took it to Rex. We sat in his car outside Federal Plaza at 2 a.m., reviewing the evidence on my laptop. "This can't be happening," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It is happening. Every night, something changes. The time of death, the wound descriptions, small details in the witness statements. It's like the case is being edited, but I can't see who's doing it or how." Rex was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "There's a guy in the behavioral analysis unit. Former profiler, now does consulting work on unusual cases. Not criminal profiling, the other stuff. Things that don't fit normal patterns. His name is Harold Vance. If anyone can help us, it's him." I met Harold Vance 3 days later at a coffee shop in Greenwich Village. He was in his 60s, gray-bearded, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Rex had briefed him on the basics, but I walked him through the details, showed him my documentation, the videos, the photographs. He listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. When I finished, he sat back and studied me for a moment. "You understand," he said carefully, "that what you're describing violates several fundamental principles of evidence handling, forensic science, and physical reality itself. I understand, but it's happening. Show me." That night, Harold Vance came to the evidence room. He brought his own equipment: cameras, sensors, recording devices I didn't recognize. We set everything up around the Treadwell evidence box and waited. At 11:45, the watch started running. Vance's sensors immediately began registering anomalies: temperature drops, electromagnetic fluctuations, something he called temporal displacement markers, though he didn't elaborate on what that meant. At 11:47, the watch stopped. The surveillance cameras went dark for 7 seconds. And when Vance checked his own equipment afterward, he found something that made him go very still. "Look at this," he said, showing me one of his devices. It displayed a waveform, tracking something he called causality patterns. The graph showed a smooth line, then a sharp disruption at exactly 11:47. This indicates a break in the normal flow of cause and effect. For those few seconds, the surveillance cameras went dark, and during that gap, events were altered. What kind of events? Small ones. Details. But enough to change the factual record. He looked at me seriously. "Agent Finch, I think what we're dealing with here is some form of temporal echo. The watch isn't just running, it's replaying the moment of death. And each time it does, it's slightly altering the past, pulling the official record toward its own frozen moment. That's impossible. So is everything else you've shown me. But the evidence is clear. Something about Marcus Treadwell's death left an imprint, a kind of wound in time itself. And that watch is the focal point, endlessly repeating those final 2 minutes." He packed up his equipment, his expression troubled. "I'll write up my findings, but I doubt anyone will take them seriously. This kind of phenomenon, if that's even the right word, it doesn't fit into any official framework. The Bureau won't know what to do with it." After he left, I sat alone in the evidence room, staring at the watch. It sat there in its evidence bag, stopped at 11:47, innocent and mundane. Just an old Timex, worn smooth by years of use. But every night, for 2 minutes, it came back to life. And every time it did, it changed something. Small details in the case file. Minor alterations to the official record. The question I couldn't answer was why. What was the watch trying to do? What was Marcus Treadwell's death trying to tell us? The answer would come soon enough. But when it did, I'd wish I'd left the watch alone in its evidence bag, stopped forever at the moment of its owner's death. The alterations to the case file accelerated. What had started as minor changes, a shifted time estimate, slightly reworded descriptions, became more substantial. Witness statements that I'd photographed just days earlier now contained different details. The crime scene diagram showed the body in a slightly different position. The ballistics report listed a different angle of entry for one of the bullets. I documented everything obsessively, taking photographs of the physical files every day, comparing them to my earlier documentation. The changes were undeniable. The case file was being rewritten, one detail at a time, and the only common factor was the watch and its nightly 2-minute run. Rex and I brought Harold Vance back for another observation. This time, he focused his equipment on the physical case file itself. Sensors pointed at the documents while we waited for 11:45. When the watch started running, Vance's equipment lit up like a Christmas tree. He gestured frantically at one of his screens, which showed what looked like heat signatures moving across the surface of the documents. "Do you see that?" he whispered, though we were alone in the evidence room. It's like the text is being rewritten in real time. I leaned over his shoulder, watching the thermal display. Hot spots appeared and disappeared on the pages, moving slowly across the text. When I looked at the actual documents, I couldn't see anything changing, but Vance's sensors were recording something invisible to the naked eye. At 11:47, the watch stopped. The surveillance cameras went dark for 8 seconds, longer than before. When they came back online, Vance immediately checked the case file. "Here," he said, pointing to a sentence in the detective's initial report. "This is new. This wasn't here an hour ago." He was right. The sentence described a witness who'd heard arguing from Treadwell's apartment around 11:40. I checked my photographs. In every previous version, that witness hadn't mentioned hearing anything unusual. "The file is retroactively creating evidence," Vance said quietly, "building toward something. Each night, it adds new details, changes existing ones. It's constructing a different version of events. But why? What's the point? I don't know. But whatever happened to Marcus Treadwell, his death left an imprint powerful enough to manipulate physical reality, and that watch is the mechanism, ticking away toward some conclusion we haven't seen yet." That night, after Vance left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the case file, about how it was changing. The new details weren't random. They were coherent, logical, building on each other. It was as if the watch was telling us a story, one detail at a time, rewriting the past to reveal something that had been hidden. The next morning, I went back to the original detective and asked about the witness who'd heard arguing. Detective Wexler sounded confused on the phone. "What witness?" "We didn't have anyone report hearing arguments." "It's in your initial report. A neighbor? Apartment 3B heard raised voices around 11:40. There was a pause. "Agent Finch, I wrote that report myself. There was no such witness. Nobody heard anything unusual that night. Could you pull up your copy and check?" Another pause, then quietly, "Hold on." I waited, listening to the sound of keyboard typing. When Wexler came back on the line, his voice had changed. "It's here, in my report. The witness statement from apartment 3B. He sounded shaken. "But I didn't write this. I've never seen this before. How is this possible?" "I don't know, but I need you to check something else for me. Your original notes, handwritten. Do they mention this witness? I'll call you back." 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Wexler's voice was tight, controlled panic barely contained. "My notes don't mention it, but my typed report does. And when I pulled up the digital copy from our database, it's there too, like it's always been there. Someone could have hacked the database and replaced the physical copy in my file cabinet and changed my typed report in a sealed case folder." He took a shaky breath. "Agent Finch, what the hell is going on with this case?" I couldn't tell him about the watch. He'd think I was insane. Instead, I thanked him and ended the call, my mind racing. The changes weren't just affecting our evidence room copies. They were propagating backward through time, altering documents in multiple locations, both physical and digital. Somehow, the watch wasn't just rewriting our case file. It was rewriting history itself. I called Rex and told him everything. He listened in silence, then said simply, "We need to see what it's building toward. Tonight, we watch the file continuously. Document every change, no matter how small." That night, Rex, Carmine, and I gathered in the evidence room at 11 p.m. We had 6 cameras set up, all focused on the open case file. We photographed every page, time-stamping everything. Then we waited. At 11:45, the watch started running. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The fluorescent lights dimmed, and on the pages of the case file we saw something that made my blood run cold. The text was moving. Not obviously, you had to stare directly at it to see. But individual letters were shifting, rearranging themselves. Words were being inserted and deleted. Whole sentences were rewriting themselves in real time. We watched, transfixed, as the crime scene report transformed before our eyes. The estimated time of death shifted again, now reading 11:44 to 11:48. A new witness appeared in the statement list, someone from apartment 4C who'd seen a man leaving Treadwell's building at 11:48. And then, most disturbing of all, a new piece of evidence was documented. A partial fingerprint on the doorframe, missed in the original collection, now identified as belonging to Stephen Wick, Treadwell's ex-boyfriend. At 11:47, the watch stopped. The surveillance cameras went dark for 10 seconds. When they came back, the transformation was complete. The case file now contained evidence that had never existed. Evidence that pointed directly at Wick as the killer. "Jesus Christ," Rex whispered. "It's framing him. The watch is retroactively creating evidence against the ex-boyfriend." "But why?" Carmine asked. "If Wick had a solid alibi, maybe the alibi was wrong," I said slowly. "Or maybe the watch is showing us what really happened, evidence that was missed or overlooked." I called Detective Wexler again, waking him up at midnight. "I need you to check Stephen Wick's alibi, the bar surveillance footage, the credit card receipts. Check them again. Agent Finch, it's midnight. Please, this is important." He called me back 3 hours later. I pulled the surveillance footage from the bar, watched the whole thing again. He paused. "Wick is there, like we confirmed before, but there's something weird about it. Around 11:30, the footage glitches. Goes dark for a few seconds, then comes back. When it resumes, Wick is in a different position, wearing a different shirt." My heart was pounding. Different how? In the earlier footage, he's wearing a blue button-down. After the glitch, it's a black t-shirt. But the timestamp doesn't jump. The clock runs continuously. It's like the footage was edited, but the metadata shows no tampering. What about the credit card receipts? Still show purchases at the bar from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. But now that I'm looking at them again, the signatures look different, like they were signed by different people. The alibi was falling apart. Or rather, it had always been false, and now reality was correcting itself to show the truth. Stephen Wick hadn't been at that bar. He'd been at Marcus Treadwell's apartment, and somehow he'd manufactured an alibi that had fooled everyone. Until a stopped watch started running again. "You need to bring Wick in for questioning," I told Wexler. "Something's wrong with this case. The evidence is changing, and it's all pointing at him." "Evidence doesn't just change, Agent Finch." "I know, but this time it did. Trust me on this." The next day, Detective Wexler called Stephen Wick in for a follow-up interview. I sat in the observation room with Rex, watching through the one-way mirror as Wexler walked Wick through his timeline for the night of the murder. Stephen Wick was a thin man in his late 30s, well-dressed, carefully composed. He answered every question smoothly, reciting his alibi with the confidence of someone who'd told the story many times. I was at Rusty's on 9th Avenue from about 10 p.m. until closing. I met some friends, had a few drinks. You've seen the surveillance footage. You know I was there. "We have," Wexler said. "But I'm curious about something. You said you were wearing a blue shirt that night." Wick hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "Yes, blue button-down. Why?" "The surveillance footage shows you in a black t-shirt. After 11:30. "That's not possible. I was wearing blue all night." Wexler slid a photo across the table, a still from the surveillance footage. "This is you at 11:45 p.m., black t-shirt. Can you explain that?" Wick stared at the photo, his composed expression cracking. I don't know. Maybe I changed shirts. Maybe I spilled something." Did you leave the bar at any point during the evening? No, I was there the whole time. The bartender doesn't remember you. I showed him your photo. He worked that night, and he doesn't remember serving you. He probably just forgot. It was months ago. Wexler leaned forward. Stephen, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you go to Marcus Treadwell's apartment on the night of August 15th? No, I told you I was at the bar. Your fingerprint was found on his door frame. Wick went very still. That's not possible. We have a partial print, matched it to your file from your previous arrest for vandalism. You were at Treadwell's apartment that night. I wasn't. But his voice had lost its certainty. I watched from the observation room as Wick slowly unraveled. The alibi he'd constructed so carefully was falling apart, contradicted by evidence that hadn't existed 3 weeks ago, but now seemed to have always been there. The surveillance footage with its suspicious glitch, the fingerprint that had been missed in the original collection, the witness who'd seen someone matching Wick's description leaving the building. After 2 hours of questioning, Wick finally broke. I loved him, he said quietly, tears streaming down his face. I loved Marcus, and he threw it away. 6 years together, and he just decided it was over. Wouldn't even talk about it. Just said he'd moved on like I was nothing. So you went to his apartment that night. I just wanted to talk. To make him understand. I wasn't going to hurt him. I needed him to listen. What happened? Wick's hands were shaking. He wouldn't let me in. Stood in the doorway and told me to leave, that he'd call the cops if I didn't go. I got angry. I pushed him. He fell, hit his head on the coffee table. And then he closed his eyes. He was just lying there, bleeding. And I panicked. I ran. He was shot, Stephen, twice in the chest. No, I didn't shoot him. I pushed him. He fell. And I left. I didn't have a gun. I've never owned a gun. Wexler glanced at the mirror, toward where Rex and I were watching. Something was wrong. Wick's confession didn't match the physical evidence. Treadwell had been shot, not beaten. There was no head trauma, no evidence of a fall, but Wick believed what he was saying. The guilt, the emotion. It was all genuine. He believed he'd killed Marcus Treadwell by pushing him, which meant either he was lying or something else had happened that night. Something the watch was still trying to reveal. Stephen Wick was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The prosecutor was confident. They had the confession, the fingerprint evidence, the suspicious alibi. It seemed like an open and shut case, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Wick's confession didn't match the cause of death. And the way the evidence had appeared, retroactively writing itself into the case file, suggested we were missing something crucial. That night, I returned to the evidence room alone. It was past midnight, the building nearly empty. I sat at my desk with Marcus Treadwell's case file spread out before me, comparing my early photographs to the current documents. The changes were extensive now. An entire alternate timeline had been constructed piece by piece over the past month. But looking at it carefully, I noticed something strange. The evidence pointed at Stephen Wick, but not in a way that matched his confession. The fingerprint, the witness sightings, the glitched surveillance footage, they suggested Wick had been at the scene, but nothing explained the gunshot wounds. At 11:45, the watch started running. I sat very still, watching it through the evidence bag. The second hand swept around the face, tick, 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 counting down the final 2 minutes of Marcus Treadwell's life. But this time something different happened. At 11:46, a new piece of paper appeared in the case file. I don't mean it materialized out of thin air. Nothing that dramatic. But when I looked down at the documents spread across my desk, there was a page I hadn't seen before. A ballistics report, freshly printed, the ink still smelling sharp and chemical. I picked it up with shaking hands. The report analyzed the bullets recovered from Marcus Treadwell's body. According to the analysis, the striations on the bullets matched a weapon registered to someone other than Stephen Wick. The gun belonged to Marcus Treadwell himself. I stared at the report, my mind racing. Treadwell had owned a firearm, a 9mm pistol, registered legally, kept in his apartment for protection. The original case file hadn't mentioned it, probably because it hadn't been found at the scene. The killer had taken it. But according to this new report, the bullets in Treadwell's body had come from his own gun. At 11:47, the watch stopped. The surveillance cameras went dark for 15 seconds, longer than ever before. When they came back online, I looked at the case file and found more new material. A witness statement from apartment 2A. The neighbor had heard two men arguing, followed by the sound of a struggle, then a single gunshot, a pause, then a second gunshot. Wick had pushed Treadwell. Treadwell had fallen, hit his head, been stunned or unconscious. And then someone else had entered the apartment and shot him twice with his own gun. Someone who'd been there all along, watching. I pulled up the surveillance footage from Treadwell's building, the original recordings from the night of the murder. The footage showed Wick arriving at 11:40, entering the building. He left at 11:46 running, clearly panicked. But at 11:47, someone else left the building. A figure in dark clothing, face obscured by a hood. They walked calmly, unhurried, carrying what might have been a bag or package. I watched the figure disappear down the street, and I realized what the watch had been showing us all along. Stephen Wick had been there. He'd pushed Treadwell, panicked, and fled. But he hadn't killed him. Someone else had. Someone who'd entered the apartment after Wick left, found Treadwell injured and vulnerable, and executed him with his own weapon. The watch had been trying to tell us that from the beginning. Each night running those 2 minutes from 11:45 to 11:47, showing us the window when the real killer had acted. And each time it ran, it rewrote the evidence to point us toward the truth. I called Rex immediately. He was at the office within 30 minutes, and together we went through the new evidence. The ballistics report, the witness statement, the surveillance footage that had always been there but never examined closely enough. "We need to identify that figure," Rex said, pointing at the hooded person on the screen. "They're our real killer." I enhanced the footage as much as I could, but the quality was poor and the person had been careful to avoid showing their face. But there was one detail, a distinctive watch on their left wrist. I could just make out the shape through their sleeve. A Timex, old, with a worn leather band. My blood ran cold. "Rex, look at this." I pulled up the evidence photo of Marcus Treadwell's watch, the one that had been running every night at 11:45. Then I compared it to the watch on the killer's wrist in the surveillance footage. They were identical. "I don't understand," Rex said. "The watch was found on Treadwell's nightstand. How could the killer be wearing it? Unless the killer had taken the watch, worn it, then returned it to the nightstand after the murder. But why? What possible reason would someone have to do that?" I thought about the watch, running every night at the exact time of death, about how it had been left behind, stopped at 11:47, as if marking the moment, about how it had been rewriting the case file, revealing the truth piece by piece. "It's not about the watch," I said slowly. "It's about the time. The killer wanted us to know exactly when Treadwell died. They staged the scene to make it look like Wick had done it, left him there injured after the confrontation, but they made sure we'd know the real time of death, 11:47. The watch was stopped then deliberately. So, who was it? Who would want Treadwell dead but frame Wick for it?" I pulled up the original case file, looking at everyone who'd been interviewed. teachers at Treadwell School, neighbors, family members, friends, and then I saw a name I'd overlooked, Patricia Morris, the colleague he'd had a dispute with over department funding. According to her statement, she'd been home with her husband all night. But when I pulled up her interview transcript, I noticed something. She'd mentioned seeing Wick arrive at Treadwell's building around 11:40. She'd been specific about the time, said she'd been taking out her trash and noticed him in the lobby, but her apartment wasn't in Treadwell's building. It was 3 blocks away. How had she seen Wick arrive? I called Detective Wexler and asked him to verify Patricia Morris's alibi. He called back an hour later. "Interesting thing about Morris," he said. "Her husband confirms she was home all night. But when I pressed him on the timing, he got vague. Said maybe she'd gone out briefly, he couldn't remember exactly. He seemed nervous. Can you bring her in for questioning?" "Based on what? A suspicious watch and a vague timeline?" "Based on new evidence, trust me on this. Patricia Morris came in voluntarily the next day. She was a small woman, mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a defensive posture. Detective Wexler and I interviewed her together. 'Miss Morris,' I said, 'can you tell us again where you were on the night of August 15th?' "At home. I already told the police this months ago." "Your original statement says you saw Stephen Wick arrive at Marcus Treadwell's building around 11:40. How did you see that from 3 blocks away?" She hesitated. "I must have been walking by, taking out trash like I said." "At 11:40 at night?" "Yes." "But your building's trash room closes at 9 p.m. It's in your lease." Her composure cracked slightly. I might have the time wrong. It could have been earlier." I slid a photograph across the table. The surveillance footage still, showing the hooded figure leaving Treadwell's building at 11:47. "This is you, Miss Morris. We can prove it. The watch on your wrist matches one found at the scene. Your height and build match. And we have a witness who places you near Treadwell's apartment at 11:45. That's not me. I was home. We also have the murder weapon, Treadwell's own gun, which you took from his apartment. We found your fingerprints on the grip. That was a lie. We didn't have the gun, and the fingerprint evidence was part of the watch's retroactive writing. But Morris didn't know that. Her face went pale. "You can't have my prints. I wore gloves." The room went silent. Wexler and I exchanged glances. She'd just confessed. "Why don't you tell us what really happened?" I said, gently. Patricia Morris sat very still for a long moment. Then she started talking. She'd been having an affair with Marcus Treadwell for 2 years. It had started as a professional relationship. They were both math teachers at the same school, and evolved into something more. She'd fallen in love with him. He'd promised to leave Stephen Wick to start a life with her. But when he finally broke up with Wick, it wasn't to be with Patricia. He'd simply wanted to be alone. He'd ended things with her gently but firmly. Said he needed time to figure out who he was. "I couldn't accept that," she said quietly. "I'd given up so much for him. My marriage was failing because of our affair. I'd risked everything, and he just dismissed me, like I was nothing." On the night of August 15th, she'd gone to his apartment to confront him. She'd waited outside, planning what to say. And then she'd seen Stephen Wick arrive, watched him argue with Treadwell in the doorway. She'd seen Wick push Marcus, seen Marcus fall and hit his head. "I thought Wick was going to kill him, but he just ran. Left Marcus there on the floor, bleeding. I went inside to help, to call an ambulance. But when I got there..." She closed her eyes. "Marcus looked up at me, and he said, 'Not you, anyone but you,' like I was the last person he wanted to see. So you shot him." I don't know what happened. I was so angry, so hurt. I saw his gun on the table. He'd gotten it out when Wick was pounding on the door, put it down when Wick left, and I just... Picked it up. I didn't even think. I just wanted the pain to stop. She'd shot him twice. Then she'd panicked, realizing what she'd done. She'd taken his watch, the one he'd worn every day, the one she'd given him as a gift early in their affair, and put it on her own wrist. Some impulse to take something of his, to prove to herself that he'd been real, that what they'd had was real. Then she'd left, calmly walking out of the building. She'd stopped on the street to set his watch to 11:47, the exact moment he'd died, before returning it to his nightstand later that night when the police had briefly left the scene unattended. She'd wanted to mark the moment, to memorialize it somehow. "I loved him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I killed him, but I loved him." Patricia Morris was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Stephen Wick was released. The charges dropped. The case that had been cold for 3 months was finally closed. But the watch kept running. Every night at 11:45 it would start. Every night at 11:47 it would stop, even after Morris's conviction. Even after the real killer was found. The watch continued its cycle. I asked Carmine about it one night. We were in the evidence room doing inventory when I mentioned the ongoing phenomenon. "Some things don't stop," he said quietly. "Some echoes keep repeating, even after the story's been told. Maybe it's just the mechanism wearing itself out. Or maybe," he paused, "maybe Marcus Treadwell's death left such a mark that it can't be erased, even by justice." I thought about that often in the weeks that followed. The watch had guided us to the truth, rewriting evidence to reveal what had been hidden. But it hadn't stopped once the case was solved. It kept running, kept marking those 2 minutes, as if the truth wasn't enough to lay the ghost to rest. 3 months after Patricia Morris's conviction, the watch finally wound down. It ran its cycle one last time, 11:45 to 11:47, and then stopped permanently. No amount of winding could restart it. The mechanism had simply given up, exhausted by its impossible task. The surveillance cameras stopped glitching that same night. The temperature in the evidence room returned to normal. The case file stopped changing. Everything returned to baseline, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. I kept the watch, though. Filed a request to retain it as a personal item after the case was fully closed and the evidence was no longer needed. Nobody questioned it. Just another piece of junk from a solved murder. Nothing special. But I keep it in my desk drawer at home. Sometimes, late at night, I'll take it out and look at it. The crystal is still cracked. The leather band is still worn. The hands are still frozen at 11:47. And I'll think about Marcus Treadwell, a man who died because he was loved by the wrong people. About Stephen Wick, who carried guilt for a crime he didn't commit. About Patricia Morris, whose love turned to murder in a moment of rage and pain. And about the watch that kept time in impossible ways, rewrote the past to serve the truth, and finally stopped when its work was done. Rex asked me once if I believed what had happened, if I really thought the watch had somehow manipulated reality, or if there was some rational explanation we'd missed. I told him I didn't know, that I'd seen the evidence, documented the changes, witnessed things that shouldn't be possible, but I couldn't explain them in any way that made sense. "Maybe it doesn't need to make sense," he said. "Maybe some things just happen, and we do our best to document them, and then we move on." He's probably right, but I can't move on entirely, because I remember standing in the evidence room at 11:46, watching text rewrite itself on paper. I remember the watch starting without being wound, running for exactly 2 minutes, stopping at the precise moment of death. I remember evidence changing, reality shifting, the past becoming fluid. And I know, with absolute certainty, that Marcus Treadwell's watch was trying to tell us something. That objects can carry intention, memory, purpose. That the dead don't always stay silent. The case is closed. The killer is in prison. Justice has been served. But sometimes, late at night, I'll be working in the evidence room and I'll feel a chill. The lights will flicker slightly, and I'll glance at my own watch and see that it's 11:47. And I'll think, somewhere in this room, in some box on some shelf, another object is waiting. Another piece of evidence carrying something it shouldn't. Telling a story nobody's listening to yet. Because that's what I learned from the Marcus Treadwell case. That evidence rooms aren't just storage facilities for physical objects. They're museums of violence, repositories of final moments, warehouses of unfinished business. And sometimes, when the evidence wants to speak, it finds a way. Even if that way violates everything we know about how the world works. Even if it requires rewriting the past, manipulating reality, breaking the laws of physics and causality. The truth, I've learned, is patient. It waits in evidence bags and file folders, in stopped watches and flickering lights. It waits for someone to listen, someone to notice the impossible details, someone willing to follow the evidence even when it leads somewhere rational thought can't follow. Marcus Treadwell's watch spoke for 2 months before falling silent. Other items in this evidence room might speak for years, or decades, or forever. I just have to listen. And late at night, when the building is empty and the fluorescent lights hum overhead, I do. I listen to the silence between things, to the empty spaces where sound should be. I watch for movement in still objects, for text that rewrites itself, for clocks that run without springs. Because I've seen evidence come alive once, and I know, with the certainty of someone who's witnessed the impossible, that it can happen again. The watch sits in my desk drawer at home, stopped forever at 11:47. But sometimes in the deep hours of night I'll wake up and think I hear it. That faint tick, tick, tick of mechanical movement, marking time that doesn't exist anymore. And I'll lie there in the dark, listening, waiting for the 2 minutes to pass, waiting for 11:47, the moment when everything changed, the moment that keeps happening over and over, in evidence rooms and case files and the impossible spaces between what was and what should have been. The debt is paid. The story is told. The case is closed. But the watch remembers. And so do I. The missing person report came across my desk on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the Adirondacks were at their most deceptive. All those reds and golds and burnt oranges, like the mountains were trying to distract you from what they really were. 6 million acres of wilderness where people disappeared and sometimes never came back. I'm Jonas Mercer, field analyst for the FBI's Albany office. I don't carry a gun. I carry databases, geographic profiles, and a laptop that weighs more than most service weapons. My job is to sit in climate-controlled rooms and tell agents where to look. But sometimes, when a case gets strange enough, they send me out to look myself. The office was quiet that afternoon. Most of the field agents were out working cases, and the administrative staff had that glazed look people get when they're counting down the hours until Friday. Outside my window, Albany looked gray and tired. The kind of autumn day where the sun never quite breaks through the clouds. I was reviewing data on a smuggling operation when Levi Quayle appeared in my doorway. Levi had a way of materializing without sound, like a ghost or a bad conscience. He was tall and thin, with close-cropped silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than flesh. In 20 years with the Bureau, I'd never seen him smile. Not once. "Mercer," he said. "Got something for you." I saved my work and turned to face him. "What kind of something?" He stepped into my office and closed the door behind him, which was never a good sign. Levi only closed doors when he was about to tell you something that shouldn't leave the room. The missing person was a man named Marcus Whitley, 42, a wildlife biologist from the State University of New York. He'd gone into the Adirondacks 3 weeks earlier to study lynx migration patterns and hadn't come back. His vehicle, a forest green Subaru Outback, was found parked at a trailhead near Lake Lila, keys still in the ignition, driver's side door hanging open like he'd left in a hurry. Marcus's wife, Elena, reported him missing after he failed to check in for 5 consecutive days. I'd spoken to her on the phone that morning before Levi came to my office. Her voice had been steady, controlled, the kind of control that comes from working very hard not to fall apart. Marcus is careful, she'd told me. He knows the risks. He's been doing field work for 15 years. He wouldn't just vanish without a reason. Did he seem worried about anything before he left? Any concerns about the work? There had been a pause on the line. He said something strange the night before he went into the forest. We were having dinner, and he got this look on his face. Distant, like he was working out a puzzle in his head. I asked him what he was thinking about, and he said, what if the lynx aren't the only things being tracked? What did he mean by that? I don't know. I asked him to explain, but he just shook his head and changed the subject. I thought maybe he was worried about the poachers, that they'd figured out he was reporting to the authorities, but now... Her voice had cracked slightly. Now, I think it was something else. Something he couldn't explain because he didn't understand it himself. That conversation had stayed with me all morning, nagging at the back of my mind. What if the lynx aren't the only things being tracked? It sounded paranoid, or maybe just the rambling thought of someone who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. But there was something about it that bothered me. Marcus wasn't the type to get paranoid. His wife had been clear about that. He was methodical, rational, a scientist to his core. If he'd said something like that, he'd had a reason. His wife reported him missing after he failed to check in for 5 consecutive days. That wasn't unusual for Marcus, apparently. He'd go silent when he was deep in his research, chasing radio-collared cats through the forest, sleeping in his tent, eating cold beans straight from the can. But 5 days was his limit. After that, he always called. This time, he hadn't. Why are we involved? I'd asked Levi Quayle, my case supervisor, when he'd first briefed me. Levi was a 20-year veteran with the Bureau, a man whose face had settled into permanent skepticism. He had gray eyes that never seemed to blink, and a way of speaking that made everything sound like a threat. Because Marcus Whitley wasn't just studying lynx, Levi said. He slid a folder across his desk. The folder was thick, held together with rubber bands, the kind of case file that had been building for years. He was also consulting for us. I opened the folder. Inside were surveillance photos, transaction records, maps marked with GPS coordinates. The photos showed men in camouflage loading black shapes into truck beds under the cover of darkness. The transaction records traced money flowing from New York to Asia, passing through shell companies and cryptocurrency wallets. The maps showed kill sites scattered across the Adirondacks, each one marked with a red X. Marcus Whitley had been helping the FBI track illegal wildlife trafficking in the Adirondacks. Poachers were taking black bears, killing them for their gallbladders, which sold for thousands of dollars per pound in traditional medicine markets. Sometimes they took the paws too, considered delicacies in certain restaurants. The operation was sophisticated, organized, and brutal. He was working a case. Peripherally, he wasn't an agent, just an expert consultant. But he had information, geographic patterns, behavioral analysis of the poachers, predictions about where they'd strike next. He was good at it. Too good. Levi tapped one of the photos. 3 weeks ago, he told his handler that he'd found something unusual, a kill site that didn't fit the pattern. He wanted to investigate personally. What made it unusual? He wouldn't say over the phone, said it was too complicated to explain without showing it. His handler told him to wait, that we'd send a team with him. But Marcus went anyway, alone, and now he's gone. You think the traffickers found out? Levi leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. His office was sparse, almost monastic. No personal photos, no decorations, just government-issue furniture and a single window that looked out over the parking lot. I think someone should go look, and since you're the one who likes playing detective in the woods, I'm sending you. That's when he'd told me about the other case. The older one. The one that made Marcus Whitley's disappearance feel less like an isolated incident and more like a pattern. There's something else you need to know, Levi had said. Marcus Whitley wasn't the first person to go missing in that area. There was someone else, a former agent named Seraphine Mott. She disappeared in those same woods 6 years ago. The name meant nothing to me at first. I was still relatively new to the Albany office, and 6 years ago I'd been working out of the D.C. headquarters, analyzing international terrorism cases. But as Levi spoke, pulling up Seraphine's file on his computer, I started to understand why he looked so tense. Seraphine Mott had been a criminal investigative specialist, not quite an agent, but close. She'd worked cold cases, disappearances, unsolved homicides. Her specialty was pattern recognition, finding connections that others missed. Apparently, she'd been very good at it. What was she working on? That's classified. But what I can tell you is that she was investigating an anomaly. A pattern she'd identified in missing person cases across the Adirondacks. Hikers, hunters, researchers. Over the past 80 years, more than 40 people had vanished in a roughly 10-mile radius. Most were never found. No bodies, no evidence, just gone. I looked at the photo of Seraphine on the screen. She was in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked capable, confident. Not like someone who'd disappear without a trace. You think it's connected? Seraphine and Marcus? I don't know. But they both went to the same area. They both were investigating patterns. And they both vanished. Levi closed the file. Seraphine went into the forest to check out an old hunting cabin she thought might be significant. She filed her itinerary, followed protocol, checked in twice by satellite phone. Then nothing. We searched for 3 weeks. Helicopters, dogs, thermal imaging. Never found a trace. It was like she stepped off the edge of the world. What about her reports? What did she say about the pattern she'd found? Levi's expression darkened. That's the problem. Toward the end, her reports got strange. She started talking about things that didn't make sense. Temporal anomalies. Recursive patterns. She said the disappearances weren't random, that there was a structure to them, a sequence. But she couldn't explain what that meant. Just that it was important, that someone needed to understand it before it was too late. Too late for what? She never said. 3 days after her last coherent report, she went into the forest and didn't come back. I sat there, processing this. 2 disappearances, 6 years apart, in the same location. Both investigators, both following patterns. It could be coincidence, but in my experience, coincidences were usually just patterns you hadn't recognized yet. Why wasn't this in my initial briefing? Because it's embarrassing, Levi said bluntly. We don't like admitting we lose our own people. And because Seraphine's case was complicated. There were questions about her mental state toward the end. Some people thought she was experiencing some kind of breakdown, that the isolation, the obsession with the case, had affected her judgment. If we acknowledge the connection between her disappearance and Marcus's, we have to acknowledge that maybe she was onto something, that maybe she wasn't unstable, that maybe something really is happening in those woods. You believe her? Levi was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. I knew Seraphine, worked with her on 2 cases before she disappeared. She was one of the best analysts I've ever seen. If she said there was a pattern, there was a pattern, whether that pattern is something we can understand. He shook his head. That's what I need you to find out. That's how I found myself driving north on Route 30 2 days later, watching the trees close in on both sides of the road like they were trying to swallow it. The Adirondacks have a way of making you feel small. These mountains are old, older than the Rockies, worn down by time into something more subtle and more patient. They don't announce themselves, they just wait. The drive took 4 hours. I left Albany in the pre-dawn darkness, my rental car loaded with gear I'd requisitioned from the field equipment locker. Tent, sleeping bag, water filtration system, first aid kit, climbing rope, emergency beacon. Everything I might need to survive in the wilderness for a week. I'd also brought my laptop, 2 external hard drives full of case files, and a portable solar charger. If I was going into the forest, I was bringing my work with me. The highway was mostly empty at that hour. A few long-haul trucks, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. The occasional car heading in the opposite direction, people fleeing the mountains for the cities. I passed through small towns that looked like they'd been abandoned decades ago and were only now being slowly repopulated by people who couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Gas stations with rusted pumps, motels with half their letters burned out, diners that might have been charming once but now just looked defeated. As the sun came up, the landscape changed. The flat, agricultural land around Albany gave way to rolling hills, then to something more dramatic. The Adirondacks aren't technically mountains in the geological sense. They're a dome of ancient rock that's been pushed up from below, then carved by glaciers into the shapes we see today. The result is a landscape that feels simultaneously ancient and unstable, like it might shift under your feet at any moment. I stopped for breakfast in a town called Speculator, population 800 and change. The diner was one of those classic upstate New York establishments, all chrome and red vinyl, with a menu that probably hadn't changed since 1975. I ordered coffee and eggs, sat at the counter, and tried not to think too hard about what I was about to do. The waitress was a woman in her 60s with iron gray hair and the kind of weathered face you get from living through too many hard winters. She poured my coffee without asking if I wanted a refill and gave me a look that suggested she'd sized me up and found me wanting. "You're not from around here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Albany, I'm with the FBI." I showed her my credentials, more out of habit than necessity. She glanced at the badge, unimpressed. "You're the 3rd person from the government who's come through here this month asking about the missing biologist. Who else came?" "State police, forest rangers. They all asked the same questions, looked at the same maps, drove up to the same trailhead. None of them found anything." She topped off my coffee. "You're not going to find anything either." "Why do you say that?" "Because people who go missing up there don't want to be found, or can't be. Either way, it's the same result." She moved away to serve another customer, leaving me alone with my eggs and that cryptic statement. I finished my breakfast and got back on the road. The last stretch to Long Lake took another hour, the road narrowing to 2 lanes and then effectively to 1 as the forest pressed in from both sides. The trees here were different from the forests I was used to. Denser, darker. The pines and hemlocks grew so close together that even in late October, with many of the hardwoods bare, the forest felt oppressive. like it was watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake. I arrived at the ranger station in the village of Long Lake just before sunset. The ranger on duty was a woman in her 50s named Carol Dennison, with iron gray hair pulled back in a braid and the kind of weathered face you get from spending most of your life outside. FBI? She said when I showed her my credentials. She didn't sound impressed. Her office was small and cluttered, every surface covered with maps, permits, incident reports. A radio crackled quietly in the corner, occasionally burping out static-laden communications from rangers in the field. You're the third person who's asked about Marcus this week. Who else came looking? His wife. Came up here 4 days ago, desperate for answers. Poor woman, I could see it in her eyes, that terrible hope that maybe we'd missed something, maybe there was still a chance. Carol shook her head. I had to tell her the same thing I'm going to tell you. We searched a 20-square-mile area. Dogs, helicopters, ground teams. If Marcus was out there, we would have found him. You said someone else came looking too. Some private investigator Elena Whitley hired. City boy, fancy gear, no idea what he was doing. I took him up to the trailhead, showed him the route Marcus usually took. He spent one night in the forest and came back the next morning, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Said he felt like he was being watched, like the forest itself was aware of him. She snorted. Probably just spooked by a bear. Did he find anything? If he did, he didn't share it with me. Just packed up his gear and drove back to wherever he came from. Elena called me the next day, furious. Said he'd taken her money and given her nothing but excuses. Carol pulled out a map and spread it across the counter. It was a topographic map of the area, covered in notations and markings in different colors. This is where we found his car. She tapped a spot near the southern edge of Lake Lila. This is the route he usually took when he was tracking the lynx. Her finger traced a meandering path through the forest, following ridge lines and creek beds. I studied the map carefully. Marcus's usual route formed a rough loop, starting at Lake Lila and circling northeast before coming back around. The terrain was challenging, but not impossible. Elevation changes of 1,000 feet or more, dense forest, multiple water crossings. But for someone with Marcus's experience, it should have been manageable. How far is that? 15, maybe 20 miles. Most people could do it in 2 days if they pushed. Marcus could probably do it faster. He knew these woods better than anyone. Better than me, and I've been working here for 30 years. But he didn't come back. No. She looked up at me, and I saw something in her expression that I couldn't quite identify. Worry, maybe, or something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't come back. I pointed to a small square marked on the map, about 8 miles north of Marcus's usual route. What's this cabin? Carol's expression changed. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around her eyes, but I'd been trained to notice micro-expressions. Whatever this cabin represented, it made her uncomfortable. Abandoned hunting lodge. Been there since the 30s, I think. Some rich family from New York City built it, used it for a few years, then let it rot. The state took it over decades ago, but never did anything with it. Hikers use it sometimes when the weather turns bad. We're supposed to keep it maintained, but... She shrugged. Budget cuts. We barely have enough staff to cover the main trails, let alone worry about some old cabin in the middle of nowhere. Could Marcus have gone there? Could have. But there's no reason he would. It's off his usual route, way off. He'd have to deliberately decide to go there, and I can't think of why he would. But I could. If Marcus had found something unusual, something that didn't fit the pattern of the poaching operation, he might have wanted to investigate somewhere remote. Somewhere away from the areas where poachers were active. The cabin would be perfect for that. When's the last time anyone checked on the cabin? Carol frowned, thinking. Must be 2-3 years ago. There was a hiker who got injured near there, broke his ankle. Ranger went out to assist, said the cabin was still standing, but pretty run down. Why? Just curious. I took out my phone and photographed the map, making sure to capture the cabin's location. Mind if I borrow this? I can make you a copy. Carol went to an ancient photocopier in the corner and fed the map through. While she worked, I looked at the incident reports pinned to a corkboard on the wall. Most were routine. Medical emergencies, lost hikers, wildlife encounters. But one caught my eye. It was from 6 years ago. A request for search and rescue assistance for a missing federal investigator named Seraphine Mott. The report listed her last known location as approximately 2 miles southeast of the hunting cabin. "This investigator," I said, pointing to the report. "Do you remember her?" Carol glanced over, and again I saw that flicker of discomfort. "I remember. Hard to forget." She was thorough, professional, asked a lot of questions about the cabin, about people who'd gone missing in the area, said she was working on a long-term project, some kind of historical analysis. Did she seem, I searched for the right word, unstable? Not at all. She seemed more grounded than most of the agents I deal with, knew exactly what she was looking for, or thought she did. Carol handed me the photocopied map. "Look, I don't know what you're expecting to find out there, but be careful. Those woods have a way of getting inside your head. You're out there alone for too long, you start hearing things, seeing things. Your mind plays tricks. I've done wilderness survival training. I know how to handle isolation. I'm not talking about survival training, I'm talking about something else." She looked at me directly, her eyes serious. "There's a reason the native people avoided that area. The Mohawk called it the place where time forgets. They said strange things happened there. People would go in and come out different, or not come out at all. You believe that? I believe that 43 people have disappeared in a 10-mile radius over the past 80 years. I believe that's statistically unlikely to be coincidence, and I believe that if you're smart, you'll be very, very careful." And I spent the rest of the evening in my motel room studying it, cross-referencing with the GPS data from Marcus's research logs. His movements over the past 6 months formed a pattern, a rough circle around the northeastern section of the wilderness. But 3 weeks ago, something had changed. His last recorded position, transmitted from his GPS collar system before his devices went silent, was northwest of his usual range, closer to that cabin. The next morning, I drove to the trailhead where Marcus's vehicle had been found. The Subaru was gone, impounded as evidence, but the spot where it had been was still marked with evidence tape fluttering in the wind. The parking area was empty except for my rental car. It was a Saturday, but the season was late enough that most hikers had moved on to other pursuits. The air was cold, sharp with the promise of winter. I could see my breath, and the ground was hard with frost. Above, the sky was a pale gray, clouds moving fast from north to south. Weather was coming in, maybe snow. I needed to move fast if I wanted to reach the cabin before the storm hit. I shouldered my pack. 40 pounds of gear. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water filtration, first aid, satellite phone, laptop, portable solar charger, evidence collection kit. I'm not an outdoorsman by training, but the Bureau makes sure its analysts can handle themselves in the field. I'd done survival training in Quantico, learned to navigate by compass, to purify water, to recognize hypothermia before it killed me. Still, as I entered the forest and the trailhead disappeared behind me, I felt the weight of the silence. The Adirondacks in late October are quiet. Most birds have migrated. The insects are dead or dormant. What you hear is wind in the pines, your own footsteps, and nothing else. The trail was well marked at first. Blue blazes painted on trees every 100 yards or so. I made good time, following the path along a creek that ran cold and clear over smooth stones. The forest here was mixed hardwood and conifer, the maples and birches already bare, their leaves forming a thick mat on the ground that muffled my footsteps. After about 2 miles, the trail began to climb. The blazes became less frequent, and the path itself grew narrower, harder to follow. I had to duck under low branches, climb over deadfall, push through sections where the forest had reclaimed what had once been a clear route. I stopped to check my GPS. I was making decent progress, averaging about 2 miles per hour. At this rate, I'd reach the cabin by late afternoon. I took a drink from my water bottle, ate a protein bar, then continued. The forest changed as I climbed higher. The hardwoods gave way to spruce and balsam fir, their branches heavy with old man's beard lichen. The air smelled of resin and decay, that distinctive scent of northern forest. Through breaks in the canopy, I could see ridgelines in the distance, dark against the pale sky. I thought about Marcus making this same journey 3 weeks ago. What had he been thinking about? Had he been worried or excited? Had he known he was walking into something he wouldn't come back from? And what about Seraphine, 6 years before that? She'd been following a pattern, chasing connections between disappearances. Had she felt the same sense of unease I was feeling now, that subtle wrongness in the air? By early afternoon, I'd covered about 8 miles. The trail had disappeared completely now, degraded into a faint suggestion of a path that might have been made by deer rather than humans. I was navigating by GPS and compass, following the coordinates Carol had given me for the cabin. I stopped to rest on a granite outcropping that overlooked a small valley. The trees below were a patchwork of bare branches and stubborn evergreens. No sign of human presence. No smoke, no structures. Just forest, endless and indifferent. The silence was profound. Not peaceful. Something else. Expectant, maybe. Like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I pulled out my satellite phone and called Levi. "Mercer?" he said. The connection was scratchy, full of static and delay. "Where are you?" "About halfway to the cabin. I'm making decent time." "Find anything?" "Not yet, but I'm not sure what I'm looking for." I paused, trying to articulate the feeling I'd been having all day. "Levi, there's something off about this place. I can't explain it. It's like the forest doesn't want me here." "That's called being alone in the wilderness, Mercer. Your brain starts playing tricks. Perfectly normal." "Maybe. But what if Seraphine was right? What if there really is something here, some kind of pattern we don't understand?" There was a long pause on the line. When Levi spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. "Mercer, I need to tell you something. Something that didn't make it into the briefing." I felt a cold thread of unease work its way down my spine. "What is it?" "Seraphine filed reports during her investigation. Detailed reports. I read them all after she disappeared, trying to understand what happened to her. Most of it was standard investigative work, but in her final report she wrote something that bothered me then and bothers me even more now." "What did she write?" "She said that the pattern she'd found wasn't just a pattern of disappearances. It was a pattern of investigation. Every person who went missing had been looking for someone else who'd gone missing. It was a chain, going back decades. Someone disappears. Someone goes looking for them and that person disappears too. Over and over. And she said..." He paused. "She said she was afraid she was about to become the next link in the chain." The forest around me seemed to darken, though the light hadn't changed. And then she disappeared. 3 days after filing that report. And now Marcus is gone. And you're out there looking for him. I understood what he was saying. I was potentially the next link in the chain. If the pattern was real, if it had some kind of, what? Agency? Purpose? Then I was walking directly into it. Why didn't you tell me this before I left? Because I wasn't sure it mattered. I thought Seraphine was seeing patterns that weren't there, connections that were just coincidence. But now, another pause. Now I'm not so sure. If you want to abort, come back. I won't question it. I won't put it in your file. You can just walk away. I looked out at the valley, at the endless forest stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there was the cabin, and maybe Marcus, and maybe answers. No, I said, I'm going to finish this. But Levi, if I don't check in by tomorrow night, send a team. A big team, and tell them to be careful. Mercer, I have to go. Battery's running low. I ended the call before he could argue. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, listening to the forest. The wind had picked up, and the pines were making that low, rushing sound they make, like water moving through a pipe. I thought about Seraphine Mott, walking through these same woods, following some pattern she'd seen, convinced she was onto something, and then vanishing. I reached the cabin just as the sun was setting. It was exactly where the map said it would be, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by white pines. The structure was in better condition than I'd expected. 2 stories, built from logs that had grayed with age but still looked solid. A stone chimney rose from one end. The windows were intact, covered with wooden shutters. A small porch ran along the front, sagging slightly but not collapsed. The clearing itself was strange. Perfectly circular, maybe 50 feet in diameter, with the cabin at its exact center. The grass was dead and brown, but it had been mowed at some point, recently enough that I could still see the pattern. Who had been maintaining this place? I stood at the edge of the trees, watching the cabin. Something about it made me reluctant to approach. It looked too neat, too preserved, like it had been waiting for someone. The light was fading fast. If I was going to explore the cabin, I needed to do it now, before full dark. I adjusted my pack and walked across the clearing. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, no rustling in the undergrowth. Just my footsteps on dead grass, each one seeming unnaturally loud. I reached the porch and stopped. There were boot prints in the dust on the wooden planks. Recent prints, not yet degraded by weather. Someone had been here within the past few days. Maybe Marcus. Maybe someone else. I approached carefully, one hand on the pepper spray on my belt. I'm not authorized to carry a firearm, but I'm not stupid either. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. Just the settling creak of old wood and the vast silence of the forest. The front door was unlocked. That should have reassured me. Marcus might have left it open when he entered, but it didn't. It felt deliberate, like an invitation, or a trap. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was a single large room on the ground floor, with a loft visible above. There was a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, a few chairs. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but it was clear someone had been here recently. There were boot prints in the dust. A sleeping bag spread out on the floor near the fireplace. Food wrappers in the corner. A camping stove, water bottles. Marcus's gear. I recognized the sleeping bag from the description his wife had given. Forest green, rated for 0 degrees. She'd been worried he wouldn't have warm enough equipment for late October, but Marcus had assured her he'd be fine. I moved deeper into the cabin, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. The last light from the windows cast long shadows across the floor. And that's when I saw the walls. They were covered in writing, not graffiti, not the usual carved initials and obscenities you find in abandoned places. This was different. The words were written in pencil, neat and small, covering every available surface. The walls, the door frames, even the ceiling beams. Hundreds of sentences, maybe thousands, all written in the same careful hand. My heart started to pound. This wasn't random. This was methodical, obsessive. Someone had spent hours, maybe days, filling every inch of surface with text. I stepped closer and started reading. Jonas Mercer will arrive on Saturday, October 19th at 6:23 p.m. My blood went cold. Today was Saturday, October 19th. I checked my watch. It was 6:21. The writing wasn't a record of something that had happened. It was a prediction about me, written before I'd even left Albany. I read the next line, my hand shaking. He will see this message and feel afraid. I was afraid, terrified. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to run back to the trailhead, to get as far away from this cabin as possible. But I forced myself to keep reading. He will search the cabin for signs of Marcus Whitley. He will find Marcus's journal in the loft. He will read it. He will understand nothing. I looked up at the loft, accessible by a ladder built into the wall. The ladder looked old, the wood worn smooth by decades of use. I didn't want to go up there. I didn't want to find what I was being told I would find. But I'm an analyst. My job is to follow evidence, even when it leads somewhere I don't want to go. I climbed the ladder. Each rung creaked under my weight. The sound was loud in the silence, jarring. As I climbed higher, I became aware of a smell. Not strong, but present, something organic, something that had been there for a while. The loft was small, barely tall enough to stand in. There was a narrow cot against one wall, a backpack in the corner. I recognized the backpack immediately. It was Marcus Whitley's. I'd seen photos of it in the case file. Forest green, with a reflective strip across the top, university logo on the side. My relief was immediate and short-lived. Marcus had been here, but where was he now? I opened the backpack carefully, using the edge of my sleeve to avoid leaving fingerprints. Inside were his research notes, his Jeep's unit, spare batteries, a water bottle, and at the bottom a spiral-bound notebook. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Not the neat, controlled script on the walls downstairs. This was the writing of someone who was afraid, who was trying to document something before it was too late. If you're reading this, you're Jonas Mercer. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you to get involved. But the cabin has rules, and one of the rules is that everyone who disappears brings someone looking for them. That's how it propagates. That's how it survives. The handwriting matched the writing on the walls. I flipped through the pages. The notebook was full of observations, timestamps, desperate attempts to make sense of something. Marcus had been documenting what was happening to him, trying to understand it even as it was happening. Day 1. I found the cabin. The writing on the walls wasn't here yesterday, I'm sure of it. I checked this place 3 days ago, and the walls were blank. Day 3. The writing is predicting things, small things at first. What time I would wake up, what I would eat for breakfast, but it's getting more specific. Day 5. It knows things I haven't done yet. It describes conversations I'm going to have, decisions I'm going to make. I tried to prove it wrong. I did everything different from what it said, but the writing changed. It's always right. Day 8. I think I understand now. This isn't a prediction, it's a description. The writing isn't telling me what I'm going to do, it's telling me what I've already done. I'm reading about my own past, but I'm experiencing it as my future. Day 12. I can't leave. Every time I try to walk away, I find myself back here. The forest loops. I've marked trees, left trail markers, followed my own footprints. They all lead back to the cabin. It's like the woods don't have an edge anymore. Or maybe I don't. Day 15. I saw Seraphine today. She was standing in the clearing, watching the cabin. She looked exactly like her bureau photo. She didn't age, she didn't speak. When I called out to her, she walked into the trees and disappeared. I found her footprints. They were fresh. I stopped reading. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Outside, it was fully dark now. I turned on my flashlight and continued reading. Day 18. The writing on the walls has reached the present. It's caught up with me. The last line on the east wall describes what I'm doing right now. It says, Marcus is reading the final entry in his notebook. He knows what comes next. But there is no next entry. I don't know what comes next. Day 19. I found more writing this morning. It was in the notebook on pages that were blank yesterday. It describes Jonas Mercer. It says the Bureau will send him to find me. It gives his arrival date and time. It says he'll find this notebook and read it. It says what he'll do after. I'm writing this now, adding to it, trying to warn him. Jonas, if you're reading this, you need to understand. The cabin isn't a place. It's a loop. It's a record of everything that happens here, written before it happens, describing it perfectly. You can't change it. You can't leave. The only way out is the entry ended there, mid-sentence. I flipped to the next page. It was blank. Then I heard the sound of footsteps on the ladder. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Someone was climbing up to the loft. I backed against the far wall, my breath coming in short gasps. A figure emerged from the opening. It was a man, gaunt and bearded, wearing clothes that were torn and filthy. For a moment I thought it was Marcus Whitley. But as he stepped fully into the loft, I realized it wasn't. It was me. He looked exactly like me. Same face, same build, same clothing. But his eyes were hollow, empty of everything except a terrible understanding. "You shouldn't have come," he said. And his voice was my voice. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at myself, trying to process what I was seeing. "How long?" I finally managed. 3 weeks, he said. Since I arrived. Since you arrived. It's hard to keep track. Time doesn't work right here. This isn't possible. I know. But you'll figure it out. You're smart. That's why Levi sent you. He smiled, and it was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. That's why the cabin wanted you. The cabin wanted... Read the walls downstairs. All of them. You'll see. He moved toward the ladder, and I stepped aside to let him pass. As he climbed down, I followed, my legs shaking so badly I could barely manage the rungs. In the main room, I turned my flashlight on the walls and started reading again, more carefully this time. The sentences were organized chronologically, starting at the door and moving clockwise around the room. They described everything that had happened since Marcus had arrived. His daily routine, his attempts to escape, his growing realization that he was trapped, and interspersed throughout were other entries, descriptions of other people who had come to the cabin, names I didn't recognize at first, but then I saw one that I did. Seraphine Mott arrived on October 14, 2018, at 4:15 p.m. She was investigating a pattern. She brought a case file containing the names of 43 people who had disappeared in the Adirondacks over the past 20 years. She didn't know they had all come here. I kept reading. Seraphine spent 16 days in the cabin. She tried to document what was happening. She took photographs, recorded audio, wrote reports, but none of it could be sent. The satellite phone didn't work. The GPS coordinates were always wrong. The photographs showed only empty forest. On her 17th day, she stopped trying to leave. She understood. The cabin had already happened to her. She was reading her own history, watching it unfold in real time, powerless to change any of it. On her 22nd day, she walked into the forest and didn't come back. Her footprints ended at a tree line. The snow beyond was undisturbed. I lowered my flashlight. The other version of me, the one who had been here for 3 weeks, was standing by the fireplace watching me. "Where is she?" I asked. "I don't know, but I see her sometimes, in the trees. She's still here. They're all still here." "Who's all?" "Everyone the cabin describes. Everyone who's ever come here looking for answers." He pointed at the wall behind me. "Look." I turned. There, written in that same careful hand, was a list of names. 43 of them, just like Seraphine's case file had contained. And at the bottom, 2 more names had been added. Marcus Whitley, Jonas Mercer. "It's been collecting us," the other me said. "For decades, maybe longer. We come here looking for someone who disappeared, and we disappear too. And then someone comes looking for us. The pattern repeats. That's not possible. Someone would have noticed. The Bureau would have. The Bureau has noticed. That's why they sent Seraphine. But she couldn't stop it. She just became part of it." He moved closer. "And now so have you. So have I. We're the same person, Jonas. You're me 3 weeks ago. I'm you 3 weeks from now. We're both trapped in the cabin's timeline." I felt dizzy. The room seemed to tilt. "I'm calling Levi. I'm getting us out of here." I reached for my satellite phone, but it was dead. The screen wouldn't turn on. I checked the battery, full charge, but the device wouldn't respond. "It won't work," the other me said. "Nothing works here. Not the way it's supposed to. The cabin doesn't exist in normal space. It's a fold, a loop. Everything that enters gets recorded, described, written on the walls. And once you're written down, you can't be unwritten." I looked around the room, at the thousands of sentences covering every surface. All of them describing events that had already happened, or were happening now, or would happen. All of them true. All of them inescapable. And then I saw it. On the north wall, at eye level, a new section of writing that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and I was only now able to see it. Jonas Mercer will spend the next 3 weeks trying to escape. He will follow the same patterns Marcus followed. He will mark trees, create maps, test every possible exit. He will fail. On his 22nd day, he will understand. I read the next line, even though I didn't want to. On his 23rd day, he will stop being afraid. He will accept what he is now, a record, a description, a sentence written on a wall. He will wait in the cabin for the next person to arrive. He will try to warn them, knowing the warning will change nothing. "No," I whispered. "No, I won't accept that." But the other me was shaking his head, that sad smile still on his face. "You will, because it's already written. It's already true. Look." He pointed at the wall above the fireplace. There, in letters larger than all the rest, was a single sentence. "Jonas Mercer is reading this sentence right now. And I was. I didn't sleep that first night. I sat on the floor of the cabin with my flashlight, reading every sentence on every wall, trying to find a contradiction, a mistake, something that would prove this wasn't real. But there were no contradictions. The writing was perfect. It described events with absolute precision, down to the exact minute, the exact word, the exact thought. The other version of me, the one who'd been here for 3 weeks, had gone up to the loft. I could hear him moving around up there occasionally, but he didn't come down. I was alone with the walls and their terrible truth. As dawn broke, gray light filtering through the shuttered windows, I forced myself to think like an analyst. There had to be a pattern, a structure I could understand. I pulled out my laptop, which still had battery, and started documenting everything. The cabin had first appeared in official records in 1934, built by a Manhattan banking family named Ashford. They'd used it for 3 summers, then abandoned it. But there were references in local historical documents to a structure in this location dating back much further. A hunter's shelter in the 1880s, a trapper's cabin in the 1820s. Even earlier, there were Native American accounts of a place in this part of the forest that was considered forbidden, a place where time didn't work correctly. I cross-referenced the names on the wall with Bureau missing person databases. Every single one checked out. 43 people had disappeared in the Adirondacks over the past 80 years, all of them within a 10-mile radius of this cabin. But they hadn't disappeared at random. There was a pattern. They all came looking for someone else. The first recorded case was in 1947. A forest ranger named William Ash went missing. 6 months later, his brother came looking for him. The brother disappeared too. In 1963, a hiker named Catherine Dell vanished. Her husband organized a search party. One of the searchers, a man named Thomas Voss, never came back. And so on, decade after decade. Someone disappears. Someone comes looking. They disappear too. It's a chain, I said aloud. A sequence. Yes, said the other me. He'd come down from the loft without me noticing. In the dawn light, I could see how much he'd deteriorated. His face was thinner, his eyes sunken. 3 weeks had aged him years. The cabin needs a pattern. It can't just take people at random. It needs them to come willingly, looking for something, looking for someone. Why? I don't know. Maybe it doesn't need a reason. Maybe it just is. Like gravity, like time. It's a fundamental property of this space. I turned back to my laptop, typing notes. Seraphine figured it out. That's why she came here. She saw the pattern in the missing person cases and realized they were connected. And then she became part of the pattern herself, just like Marcus, just like us. I stood up, my back aching from sitting on the floor all night. There has to be a way to break it. If we can understand the mechanism, we can find a flaw. I thought that too. For the first 2 weeks, that's all I did. I searched every inch of this cabin. I measured distances, took soil samples, recorded electromagnetic readings. All my instruments worked fine. There's nothing unusual about this place, physically, but it's still a trap. Then the trap is conceptual, not physical. It's in how we think about the space, how we navigate it. I tried that too. I mapped every possible cognitive bias. I tested my perceptions against objective markers. The problem isn't in my head, Jonas. It's in the forest. Or maybe it's in both. Maybe there's no difference here. I walked to the door and opened it. Outside, the clearing was bathed in soft morning light. The forest beyond looked perfectly normal. Peaceful, even. I could see the path I'd taken yesterday, my footprints still visible in the soft earth. I'm going to walk out, I said. I'm going to follow my own tracks back to the trailhead. I did that twice. You end up here again. Maybe I'll do something different. You won't, it's already written. I looked at the wall beside the door. There, in fresh pencil, was a new entry. On his first full morning, Jonas will attempt to leave. He will follow his previous day's footprints northwest for 2.3 miles. At 9:47 a.m., he will realize he's walking in a circle. He will arrive back at the cabin at 10:15 a.m. I checked my watch. It was 8:30 a.m. I'm not going to do that, I said. I'm going to do the opposite. I'll head southeast instead. The other me just looked at me with infinite sadness. Read the next line. Jonas will decide to head southeast instead. He will walk for 1.8 miles. He will arrive back at the cabin at 10:15 a.m. My hands clenched into fists. This is impossible. You can't predict human decisions with perfect accuracy. Free will exists. Does it? Or is free will just a story we tell ourselves? Maybe every decision we make is predetermined by the state of our neurons, our environment, our history. Maybe we're all just following a script we can't see. He gestured at the walls. Here, the script is visible. That's the only difference. I walked out of the cabin anyway. I headed southeast, exactly as the wall said I wouldn't. I walked fast, practically running, pushing through underbrush, ignoring the scratches from low branches. I checked my compass every few minutes. Southeast. I was going southeast. At 9:47 a.m., I stopped. Something felt wrong. I pulled out my GPS unit. It was working, showing my position clearly. But the position didn't make sense. According to the GPS, I was northwest of the cabin, not southeast. I turned around and started walking back the way I'd come. At 10:15 a.m., I emerged into the clearing. The cabin was there, waiting for me. The other me was sitting on the porch. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I went back inside and checked the wall. Below the prediction of my movements, a new sentence had appeared. Jonas will return at 10:15 a.m. He will begin to understand. Over the next 3 days, I tested every possible variable. I tried leaving at different times, in different directions. I tried not leaving at all. I tried destroying my compass, my GPS, all the tools I was using to navigate. Nothing changed. Every attempt ended the same way. I would walk for a while, certain I was going away from the cabin, and then I would be back. On the 4th day, I stopped trying to leave. Instead, I focused on the cabin itself. I tore up floorboards looking for something hidden underneath. I climbed onto the roof and inspected the chimney. I examined every log, every nail, every piece of wood. The cabin was just a cabin, old but ordinary. There was no mechanism, no device, no scientific explanation for what was happening. "You're wasting time," the other me said. He rarely spoke now. He spent most of his time sitting by the fireplace staring at nothing. "I have to try." "No, you don't. You just think you do. But it's all part of the pattern. 4 days of searching the cabin. It's written on the wall. You're just acting out what's already been described." I wanted to argue, but he was right. I checked the wall. There it was, a detailed account of everything I'd done over the past 4 days. Every floorboard I'd pulled up, every measurement I'd taken, all of it predicted, all of it accurate. That night, I read Marcus Whitley's journal again, looking for something I'd missed. His entries became increasingly desperate toward the end. He'd tried everything I'd tried with the same results. But in one of the final entries, he'd written something that caught my attention. "I think the cabin is a record, not a place, but a history. Everything that happens here is being written down, but not by anyone. The writing just appears, as if the cabin itself is conscious, or as if consciousness is a property of the space. I'm not being observed. I'm being documented. There's a difference. I thought about that. A record, not a trap. Documentation, not imprisonment. It was a subtle distinction, but maybe an important one. If the cabin was a record, then it wasn't trying to hold me here. It was simply describing what was already true. The question was, why couldn't I leave? Was it because the cabin prevented me, or because leaving was no longer something that existed in my future? I went outside and looked at the forest. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light between the trees. Somewhere out there was the regular world, where cause preceded effect, where the future was unwritten. But I couldn't reach it. Not from here. Seraphine figured something out, I said. The other me had followed me outside. We stood together in the clearing, two versions of the same person, separated by 3 weeks of impossible time. What makes you think that? Because she's not here. The wall says she walked into the forest and disappeared. Her footprints ended. That means she found a way out. Or it means she died. The wall would have said that. It says everything else. Why would it omit her death? The other me considered this. For the first time in days, I saw something like hope flicker across his face. What are you thinking? I'm thinking the cabin's record is complete. It describes everything that happens within its boundaries. But Seraphine stopped being describable. She found a way to become unwritten. How? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. I spent the next week reading everything Seraphine Mott had written on the walls. Her entries were scattered throughout the cabin, mixed in with descriptions of other people, other times. But I started compiling them, arranging them chronologically, trying to understand her thought process. Seraphine had been meticulous. She'd documented not just what happened to her, but her analysis of it. She was a trained investigator, and she treated the cabin like a case. Day 8. The writing on the walls isn't just predictive. It's recursive. It describes itself describing things. For example, Seraphine reads the sentence about Seraphine reading a sentence about Seraphine reading a sentence. The recursion goes down several levels. This suggests the cabin exists in multiple temporal layers simultaneously. Day 11. Tested time dilation effects. My watch shows 24 hours passing, but the sun position suggests only 18 hours. The discrepancy is increasing. Time inside the cabin is running slower than time outside, or faster. Hard to tell which is the reference frame. Day 14. Found something in the loft, a loose floorboard, underneath, carved into the subfloor. If you're reading this, there is a way out, but you cannot walk it. You must fall. No signature, no date. How long has this been here? I went up to the loft and found the loose floorboard. I pried it up. There was the carving, exactly as Seraphine had described. The wood was old, the letters worn. This message had been here for decades, maybe longer. You must fall. What does that mean? I asked the other me. He'd followed me up to the loft. We were spending more time together now, the two of us. The separation between us was becoming less distinct. Sometimes I couldn't remember if something had happened to me 3 days ago or 3 weeks ago. We were merging, or maybe we'd always been the same person and the distinction had been an illusion. Maybe it's metaphorical, he suggested. Fall from grace, fall from understanding, let go of something. Or maybe it's literal. Seraphine's footprints ended at a tree line. What if she jumped? What if she fell, and that broke the pattern? Jumped from where? The cabin's only 2 stories. That wouldn't even break a leg. I looked around the loft, thinking. Then I climbed back down and went outside. The other me followed. We walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking at the trees. "There," I said, pointing. At the edge of the clearing, one of the white pines was significantly taller than the others. It had to be 80 feet high, maybe more. Low branches made it climbable, at least for the first 30 feet. After that, it got more difficult. "You think she climbed that tree and jumped?" "I think it's possible. The wall says her footprints ended. If she climbed a tree, there wouldn't be any footprints leading away. That would kill her. 80-foot fall onto forest floor? Fatal. Maybe. Or maybe that's the point. Maybe you have to be willing to die to escape. Maybe the cabin can only hold you if you're trying to survive." We stood there, looking up at the tree. The wind moved through its upper branches, making a sound like rushing water. "Are you going to try it?" the other me asked. "I don't know. Let me think about it." But even as I said it, I was walking to the wall to check what was written there. I had to know if this was predicted, if the cabin had already described what I was going to do. I found the entry near the ceiling, letters so small I had to use my flashlight to read them. On his 19th day, Jonas will consider climbing the tall pine. He will spend 3 hours debating whether this is the way out. He will not climb the tree. Not yet. On his 21st day, he will try. I checked my watch, then checked the calendar on my phone. It was day 19. The other me was reading over my shoulder. So we wait 2 more days. Apparently, those 2 days were the longest of my life. I tried to occupy myself by continuing to analyze Seraphine's notes, but my mind kept returning to the tree. I checked the wall every few hours, looking for new entries about what would happen on day 21. But there was nothing. The description ended with, "He will try." Try what? Try to climb? Try to jump? Try to escape? The ambiguity terrified me. On day 20, I noticed something strange. The other me was becoming less substantial. Not invisible exactly, but translucent. I could see through him to the wall behind him. When he moved, there was a slight delay, like he was a video with bad frame rate. "What's happening to you?" I asked. "We're synchronizing," he said. His voice sounded distant, echoey. "You're almost caught up to where I am in the timeline. Soon we'll be the same moment, the same person. The distinction between us will collapse. What happens then?" "I don't know. No one's written it yet." That night, I barely slept. I lay on the floor of the cabin, staring at the ceiling, reading and rereading the same sentences. My mind was racing, trying to think through every possibility. If I climbed the tree and jumped, I would probably die. But death might be preferable to staying in the cabin forever, trapped in a loop of described moments, acting out a script I couldn't change. But if I survived the fall, what then? Would I be outside the cabin's influence? Or would I just be injured, still trapped, but now unable to move? And there was another possibility, one I didn't want to think about but couldn't avoid. What if the fall didn't kill me? What if it did something worse? What if it broke me in some fundamental way, left me conscious but shattered, unable to do anything but suffer, while the cabin continued to describe my agony? When dawn came, I was still awake. The other me had vanished completely during the night. I was alone again. Or maybe I'd always been alone and he'd been a projection, a glimpse of my own future. I checked the wall. Day 21, today. I made myself eat something, drink some water. Then I walked outside to the tall pine. Up close, it looked even more imposing. The trunk was thick, the bark rough. I reached up and grabbed the lowest branch, pulled myself up. The climbing was easier than I'd expected. The branches were spaced well, and my adrenaline gave me strength. I climbed for what felt like an hour, but my watch said only 15 minutes. Time was running strange again, or maybe it was my perception. At about 50 feet up, I stopped and looked down. The cabin looked small from here, toy-like. The clearing was a perfect circle, which I hadn't noticed from the ground. The forest beyond stretched in every direction, endless. I kept climbing, 60 feet, 70. The branches were getting thinner now, harder to trust with my weight. The wind was stronger up here, making the whole tree sway. I wrapped my arms around the trunk and held on, breathing hard. At what I estimated was 80 feet, I found a branch strong enough to stand on. I eased myself into a standing position, holding the trunk for balance. From here, I could see for miles. The Adirondacks spread out in every direction, mountains and valleys, lakes glinting in the morning sun. It was beautiful, and then I looked down at the clearing again and saw something that made my blood run cold. There were people down there, dozens of them, standing in a circle around the cabin, all facing inward. I recognized some of them from the names on the wall. Marcus Whitley, Seraphine Mott. Others I didn't know, however. They were translucent, like ghosts, but I could see them clearly. They were all looking up at me, and they were all smiling. I realized then what "you must fall" meant. Not jump, not let go. Fall, as in fail, as in surrender to gravity, to inevitability, to the pattern. The cabin didn't want me to escape. It wanted me to become like them. Another ghost, another sentence on the wall, another person standing in the clearing waiting for the next arrival. I started to climb back down. I had to get away from this tree, from this height, from this terrible revelation. But my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't grip the branches properly. My foot slipped, I fell. It wasn't a long fall, maybe 10 feet before I hit a lower branch, but it was enough. I felt my ribs crack, the air rush out of my lungs. I grabbed for the branch but missed. Fell another 5 feet, hit another branch. This time I managed to catch myself, arms wrapped around rough bark, legs dangling. I hung there for a moment, gasping, tasting blood in my mouth. Then slowly, painfully, I climbed back down to the ground. The ghosts were gone. The clearing was empty. Just me and the cabin. I limped inside and checked the wall. There was new writing. On his 21st day, Jonas climbed the tree. He saw the others. He understood. He fell, but survived. This is not the ending. I sat down on the floor, holding my injured ribs. Pain radiated through my chest with each breath. I'd failed. I hadn't escaped. I was still here, still trapped, still being described. But I'd learned something. The cabin wasn't empty. It was full of everyone who'd ever been caught in its pattern. They were still here, all of them existing in some state between presence and absence. And they were waiting for what? I didn't know, but I was going to find out. The injury to my ribs made everything harder. Breathing hurt. Moving hurt. Sleeping was nearly impossible. But in a strange way, the pain helped. It gave me something to focus on besides the walls and their endless predictions. I spent the next few days going through Seraphine's entries again, this time looking for anything about the ghosts. She hadn't mentioned seeing them directly, but there were oblique references. Day 16. Heard voices outside last night. Couldn't make out words, but there were multiple speakers. When I looked out the window, the clearing was empty. Checked the wall. It says, "Seraphine hears the previous occupants discussing her arrival." Previous occupants. How many have there been? Day 19. The cabin isn't imprisoning us. It's preserving us. I think everyone who's ever come here is still here, in some form. We become part of the record, part of the pattern. The cabin is a kind of memory, and we're the contents of that memory. I thought about this while watching the sun set through the window. A memory. A record. Everyone who'd ever been here was still being described, still existing in the cabin's eternal present tense. And then I understood. The way out wasn't physical. It wasn't climbing a tree or walking a path or finding a hidden door. The way out was temporal. I needed to stop being described in the present tense. I needed to become past tense. History. Something that had already happened and was over. But how do you make yourself past tense when every moment you experience is being written as it happens? I went to the wall where Seraphine's entries ended. Her last entry read, Day 22. I understand now. The cabin can only describe what we do, not what we are. It can record our actions, but not our existence. To leave, I must stop acting. I must become still, not dead. Death is an action, an event. I must become so still that I'm no longer worth describing. And then, perhaps, I can slip between the sentences. Below that, there was one final line. Seraphine walks into the forest at 3:17 p.m. Her footprints end at the tree line. After this, the cabin has nothing to say about her. I checked my watch. It was 2:45 p.m. If I was going to try this, I needed to do it soon, while the sun was still up. I went outside. The clearing was empty, but I knew the ghosts were there, watching. I could feel their attention like pressure against my skin. I walked to the edge of the clearing, to the tree line where Seraphine's footprints had ended. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing despite the pain in my ribs. Then I took a step forward into the forest. The moment my foot crossed the boundary, I felt something change. The air became thicker, heavier. Sound dampened. My heartbeat slowed. I took another step, and another. Each step was harder than the last, like I was wading through invisible resistance. After 10 steps, I could barely move. After 15, I had to stop. I looked back at the cabin. It was maybe 30 feet away, but it felt like miles. The distance between me and it was more than physical. It was conceptual, temporal. I was moving away from the cabin's present tense into some space where I hadn't been described yet. I kept walking. Each step took enormous effort. My vision started to blur. My sense of self began to fragment. I couldn't remember my name. I couldn't remember why I was here. All I knew was forward, the direction I was moving, the only direction that mattered. After what might have been minutes or hours, I stopped being able to move at all. I was frozen, mid-step, one foot in front of the other, completely still. I couldn't feel my body anymore, couldn't feel anything except a vast, empty awareness. And then I heard something, a voice, many voices, the ghosts speaking in unison. Jonas Mercer stops moving at 4:23 p.m. He becomes still. He stops being describable. And then, the sentence ended. The voices fell silent. I stood there in that impossible stillness for a length of time I can't measure. Maybe seconds, maybe years. And then, slowly, I started to feel something. Not my body, not the forest, but something else. A loosening, like I was coming untethered from the pattern, from the script, from the endless description. I felt myself beginning to fall away from the cabin's timeline, not forward into the future, not backward into the past, but sideways into some direction that didn't have a name. The last thing I remember is the clearing, the cabin, the forest, all of them starting to fade like an old photograph left in the sun. And then nothing. I woke up on the trail 1/2 mile from the parking area where I'd left my car. It was dawn. My watch said I'd been gone for 24 days. My ribs still hurt. My clothes were torn and dirty. I had Marcus Whitley's journal in my backpack and my own notes about everything I'd experienced. But when I checked my GPS, it showed no record of the cabin. The coordinates I'd marked pointed to empty forest. I hiked back to my car and drove to the nearest town, called Levi Quayle from a payphone because my satellite phone still wasn't working. "Mercer," he said, "where the hell have you been? We've had teams searching for you for 3 weeks." "I found Marcus Whitley," I said. "Or rather, I found where he went. I need to debrief in person. This isn't something I can explain over the phone." "Are you injured?" "Broken ribs, but I'm okay. Get to a hospital. I'll meet you there." I spent 2 days in the hospital in Albany while they x-rayed my ribs and ran every test they could think of. Physically, I was fine, except for the injury. But the doctors were concerned about psychological trauma. They kept asking me if I remembered what happened, if I'd hit my head, if I'd been disoriented. I told them I remembered everything. That was the problem. Levi came to see me on the 3rd day. I gave him Marcus's journal and my own notes. I told him everything. The cabin, the writing on the walls, the ghosts, Seraphine's final entries, how I'd escaped by becoming still, by stopping being describable. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "This is going to be classified," he finally said. "Above, top secret. No one can know about this." "Why?" "Because if this gets out, every crackpot and thrill-seeker in the country will go looking for that cabin, and they'll find it because it wants to be found. That's how it propagates. Someone disappears, someone goes looking, the pattern continues. So, what do? We do nothing. We close the case. Marcus Whitley is officially missing, presumed dead. You were lost in the wilderness for 3 weeks and found your way out. That's the official story. The real story stays between us." "And Seraphine?" Levi's expression darkened. "Seraphine understood the risk. She knew what she was looking for. Maybe she found a way out like you did. Maybe she didn't. Either way, she's gone." He stood up to leave, then paused at the door. "Mercer, I'm taking you off field work for a while. You need rest. You need therapy. What you experienced." He shook his head. "No one should have to go through that." "I'm fine." "No, you're not. But you will be. Give it time." He left. I sat in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the cabin, about the walls covered in writing, about the ghosts standing in the clearing, waiting, about Seraphine Mott, who'd found a way to become unwritable and vanished into whatever space exists between sentences. That night, I woke up at 3 a.m. with a terrible certainty. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, where I'd been transcribing the most important passages from the cabin walls. I scrolled to the end, to the last entry I'd seen before I escaped. It read, "Jonas Mercer leaves the cabin's influence at 4:23 p.m. on his 24th day. He returns to normal space. He spends 3 days in the hospital. He is debriefed by Levi Quayle. He believes he has escaped." I read that last sentence 3 times. He believes he has escaped. Not he has escaped, not he is free. He believes. I got out of bed, despite the pain in my ribs, and went to the window. Outside, Albany was dark and quiet. Normal city streets, normal buildings, normal world. But as I looked out at the city, I noticed something. The cars on the street below weren't moving. The traffic light had been red for as long as I'd been watching, and it wasn't changing. A person on the sidewalk was frozen mid-step. I looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand wasn't moving. And then I noticed the reflection in the window. Not my reflection. Someone standing behind me. When I turned around, the hospital room was empty. But when I looked back at the window, the reflection was still there. It was Seraphine Mott. She was smiling sadly. and behind her I could see dozens of others. Marcus Whitley, the other version of me, all the ghosts from the clearing. I backed away from the window, heart hammering. I went to the door and pulled it open. The hospital corridor beyond was empty. No nurses, no other patients, no sound except my own breathing. I ran down the corridor looking for anyone, anything, but every room I passed was empty. Every window showed the same frozen city. Time had stopped, or I had stopped within time, and I couldn't tell which. Finally, I found a room with a television on. The screen showed static at first, then resolved into an image. It was the cabin. The camera moved through the interior, showing the walls covered in writing. And then it focused on one section, letters zooming into clarity. Jonas Mercer believes he escaped. He spent 3 days in a hospital. He was debriefed. He returned to his normal life. But this is not his normal life. This is the cabin's memory of his normal life. He never left. He became still, and in becoming still, he became part of the record. He is a sentence on a wall, reading itself, believing it is something more. He will realize this truth at 3:17 a.m. on his third night in the hospital. He will understand that he is still in the cabin, has always been in the cabin, will always be in the cabin. And then he will join the others in the clearing, waiting for the next person to arrive. The pattern continues. I looked at my watch. It was 3:16 a.m. I ran. I don't know where I thought I was going, but I ran anyway. Down corridors that looked less and less like a hospital and more like the interior of the cabin. The walls were wood now instead of plaster. The fluorescent lights became lanterns. And everywhere, covering every surface, was writing. Sentences upon sentences, describing everything, predicting everything, containing everything. I burst through a door and found myself in the clearing. The cabin was behind me. The forest was ahead. And in the space between, standing in a perfect circle, were all the ghosts. They were waiting. Seraphine Mott stepped forward. "Welcome back, Jonas," she said. "We knew you'd figure it out eventually." "This isn't real," I whispered. "I escaped. I got out." "You became still," she said gently. "That's not the same as leaving. You just moved into a different part of the pattern, a part where you believe you're free. But the cabin is patient. It let you have that belief for 3 days. Now it's time to accept what you are." I looked around at all the faces. Marcus Whitley, the other version of me, dozens of others I didn't know, all of them caught in the same pattern, all of them described on walls that existed outside of time, all of them waiting. "What are we waiting for?" I asked. "The next one," Seraphine said. "Someone will come looking for you eventually. They always do. And when they arrive, we'll be here to welcome them. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." I looked back at the cabin. The door was open, and I could see inside. The walls were covered in fresh writing. It was describing this moment, this conversation, everything I was thinking and feeling and saying. And at the very end, in letters that seemed to glow in the moonlight, was a single sentence. "Jonas Mercer understands now. He takes his place in the clearing. He waits." I felt something shift inside me. The resistance, the fear, the desperate need to escape. It all drained away. I understood what Seraphine had meant. We weren't imprisoned, we were preserved. We were the cabin's memory. And memory doesn't escape itself. It just is. I walked to the circle and found my place among the others. We stood there together, faces turned toward the forest, waiting. Somewhere out there, someone was wondering what happened to Jonas Mercer. Eventually, they would come looking. They would find the cabin. They would read the walls. and the pattern would continue sentence after sentence, person after person, forever describing itself in an endless present tense. And we would be here, waiting to welcome them home.